Daimon, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book Number 6, written by Felicity Heaton and narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. This wasn't going well. Daimon slipped a throwing knife from the holster that sat against his ribs over his navy roll-neck long sleeve and funneled his power into it before sending it flying at the demon running right at him across the dewy moonlit grass of Hyde Park. The small blade hit its target, nailing the human-looking male in the chest. Ice immediately spread outwards from the point of impact, and the male grunted and went down clutching his chest, as glittering frost flowers rapidly covered it. His skin darkened, turning mottled in the low light, appearing almost black. Beside Daimon, his older brother Ares unleashed a wave of fire at another two demons, driving them back, and tossed a fireball at a third. They had expected this. What they hadn't expected was that it would take so long to close one of the main gates. Behind him, Valen grunted and muttered a black curse in the mortal tongue. The scent of his brother's blood hung heavily in the damp autumnal night air. Worry ran through Daimon, and not only him. Ares flicked a concerned glance over his broad shoulder, the fires of the underworld raging in his eyes, making them glow in the darkness. Ava bit out something in Italian. She had stopped speaking English around 5 minutes ago, when Valen had announced the gate was resisting his attempt to seal it, and had decided to spill more of his blood in the hope it would speed the process along, since 20 demons had descended on them. "I'm gonna need more," Valen gritted, his voice tight and speaking of the frustration Daimon could feel in him, as well as the pain. "Too risky," Ares answered as a whip made of fire appeared in his right hand, and he narrowed his gaze on the trees that enclosed one side of the area around the gate. Demons spilled from them, cutting across the paths and the grass, heading right for him. He grunted as he lashed out at the demons with the flaming whip, driving them back and stopping them from reaching Valen. "You sure you're using the right wards, or doing them right? I mean, we all know how shitty your wards are." Valen chuckled, the sound out of place given the graveness of the situation. "Don't know what you're talking about. My wards are beautiful." They weren't. Valen had never bothered to apply himself when it came to studying wards. Their father Hades, the god-king of the underworld, had gone as far as calling them bad. It took a lot for their father to admit to a fault in any of his sons, let alone point it out to the entire family. "You're definitely using the right ones?" Daimon didn't take his eyes off the demons as they made another attempt to get past him and Ares, breaking into 4 teams of 4 and coming at them in one wave. The longer this war to protect the gates between the mortal realm and the underworld went on, the more organized the demons were becoming. He swore the enemy were training them, teaching them how to fight as a unit, turning them into soldiers. He had to admit he'd preferred it when the demons had been lone wolves, only a few of them reckless enough to succumb to the lure of breaching a gate and entering the underworld, a realm they were forbidden to enter, just like Daimon and his brothers. Only unlike the demons, he could go home once this war was done. He drew down a breath and threw his right hand forwards as he summoned the power. The dew on the grass became 1,000 tiny ice needles that flew through the air and hammered into one of the demons, taking him down. The female demon who had been running beside that wretched male shrieked as she was caught by a few of the small spears of ice, her ear-splitting cry piercing enough that Daimon flinched and his next wave missed their target. "Exactly as Cal told me," Valen huffed, and water sloshed as he moved, a reminder to Daimon to keep his distance from his brother, since standing in the round pond was the only way for Valen to get close enough to the gate to spill his blood on it. The last thing Daimon wanted was to accidentally freeze the small lake. Valen grumbled, "And Karis hammered home around 30 times. His violet-haired brother wasn't embellishing that. Karis, their oldest brother and self-appointed leader, had sat Valen down on one of the cream couches in the Tokyo mansion and gone over the wards at least 36 times. In the end, Valen had stepped, a term they used for teleporting since it only took a single step for them to travel great distances, to escape another round of which wards went where. It wasn't that Karis didn't trust Valen to get it right, it was that this was important. Since the enemy had revealed they were in possession of 2 of the Erinyes, goddesses who had the ability to siphon powers and who strengthened that power by passing it between them in a cycle, And those Irenaeus had gotten their hands on the ability to command the gates Daimon and his brothers protected. They had been on red alert. The gates were the focus of their mission, the reason Hades had banished Daimon and his brothers to the mortal world 2 centuries ago, after the Moirai had foreseen a great calamity, one where an unknown enemy would breach the gates between the mortal realm and the underworld, fusing the two into a new hellish realm. It had come to light that he and his brothers were more than just protectors of the gates, though. They were bound to them in blood, a bond forged at the time of their birth, one gate created for each of them. Cal had managed to close his twin sister's gate in Seville, and had gone over everything he had done using wards, a sort of spell, to seal it and conceal it, stopping it from opening and rendering it safe from the enemy. With the enemy able to open the gates thanks to the power the Irenaeus had stolen from Mirinda, Cal's girlfriend and the third Irenaeus, and the fact the enemy seemed bent on breaching at least one gate before that power faded, Karis had decided they needed to act. Closing the gates was dangerous, because it meant there were fewer gates to share the power that flowed between them all, and that would make them more unpredictable and harder to command. But it was a necessary risk, and the only path open to them. It would not only give the enemy fewer gates they could hit, but it would mean that the enemy couldn't split him and his brothers up as easily. Valen had volunteered to seal the London gate, which was bound to him, and Cal had volunteered to close the main Seville gate. Cal was there now with Karis, Merrick, and Katerina, Merrick's girl fiend, as Valen called her because she was a hybrid, a human who had been given demon blood by the enemy in an attempt to take down Merrick. Everyone had thought sealing a main gate would be as simple as closing the twin gate had been for Cal. Apparently, everyone had thought wrong. Ares took out another 2 demons, bringing their numbers down, but still not enough to satisfy Daimon. He imbued another 2 knives with his ice and let them fly. One of them buried to the ring-shaped hilt in the forehead of a female demon, and the other slammed into the throat of the male behind her. Valen bit out a ripe curse. Daimon didn't take his focus away from the demons charging toward him. Ares looked back at their brother and swore too. That didn't sound good. Daimon risked a glance over his shoulder as he sent a thicker spear of ice flying at the closest demon, cleaving the male in 2 at the waist. "Shit," he muttered as he spotted what his brothers had. More demons sprinting towards them from the other side of the round pond, a shadowy mass of them silhouetted before the elegant red brick and sandstone Kensington Palace. The new horde of demons split into 2 groups as they reached the far end of the pond, coming at them from both sides. Above the water, the flat disk of the gate shimmered in a rainbow of colors, chasing back the darkness. The thick rings rotated slowly in opposing directions, all of them chasing around the central violet circle. Glyphs encircled each band, smaller ones that filled the gaps between them and larger ones inside the ring. The power of the gate hummed in the air, inside him, drew him to it with a promise that on the other side was home. Home. A place he wanted to go more than anything. There his power was under his control, would no longer shimmer over his skin in a way that felt like a curse. Here, he couldn't touch anyone, not even his brothers, without risking killing them with his ice, or severely maiming them at the very least. Here, he was alone, even within the circle of his brothers. The blood Valen had spilled on the gate absorbed into it, the colors that danced across its surface and curled into the air like faint smoke brightening again. It was beautiful. Beautiful and vulnerable. Daimon's stomach swirled as the demons closed in, the foul coppery odor of them filling the air, drawing out his darker side. He wouldn't let them near the gate. He closed his eyes, drew down a slow breath that filled his lungs, and focused his power, calling on it. His blood chilled and he shuddered, huddling down into the tall neck of his long-sleeved sweater and his ankle-length black coat, trying to keep that cold at bay. It never worked. It was always there, always part of him in this world, a constant presence that drained him emotionally. He flicked his eyes open and swiftly raised both of his gloved hands. Around him, his brothers, and the gate, hundreds of clear shards of ice shot from the earth and the water to form a circular wall 40 feet tall. Daimon sagged forwards, and Ares came to check on him as Valen muttered an oath. His older brother ghosted a hand over Daimon's spine, the warmth that emanated from him giving Daimon a brief reprieve from the cold. Ares shared his problem. His brother's power over fire had manifested in this world, meaning he couldn't touch anyone without the risk of burning them. Or at least he hadn't been able to until Megan, a carrier with the ability to heal, had come into his life. Megan was immune to Ares' fire and could withstand Daimon's ice, and he and his brothers had surmised she was closer to her demigod ancestors than most carriers. "Can you get it done?" Daimon pressed his hands to his thighs and ignored the way the frost on his leather gloves spread onto his black jeans. "Give me a minute." Valen went back to work, holding his arm out over the gate and closing his eyes as his blood spilled onto it. Beside him, Ava, his brother's mortal assassin girlfriend, shifted foot to foot, concern shining in her rich blue eyes. "I'll handle these guys." Ares straightened and broke away from Daimon, heading for the few demons that had ended up within the ice wall. Daimon wanted to help him, but he needed to focus on the wall. Where it touched the water, it was in danger of melting, was weaker and vulnerable. The demons had already figured that out and were beating it with fist and claw, attempting to break through. He focused there, summoning more shards of ice to reinforce it, wishing Escher were here. His brother would have used that water to his advantage, would have drowned all the demons in a heartbeat. Daimon looked at the gate and fought the urge that suddenly sparked to life inside him. Escher was on the other side of that gate, in the underworld, hunting for one of the enemy who had slipped through the gate in Paris. He was alone, lost to his other side. Daimon rose to his full height and drifted towards the gate, pulled to it as his heart filled with a need to find Escher. Pain bloomed inside him, searing his bones in multiple places where an injury didn't exist on his own body. It existed on Escher's. Daimon could feel them, the depth of the bond they had forged over the centuries, relaying not only the pain his brother felt, but the anger and frustration, the rage. The other side of Escher, the savage and cold one that had been born in the darkest of times, was firmly in control. Daimon could feel that too. He needed his brother back with him, not only because he needed to know he was safe and because he was worried about him, missed him. He needed him back so he could bring him back. Escher had confessed to him once that he feared that other side of himself, that he loathed it. Daimon could only imagine how his brother was suffering now, a slave to his darker side, driven to hunt and not rest until he had secured his prey. The Wraith, Eli. If they could get their hands on him, they might be able to find out who was behind this attempt to breach the gates. Once they had believed it was purely the work of demons, but then they had discovered a hellspawn, what he and his brothers called the species of demons who had been allowed to remain in the underworld after the last rebellion against Hades was involved, and now there were goddesses on the enemy side. Where did it end? Someone was behind all of this, and all they had to go on was that it was a female. Their father had sent them a long list of possible enemies currently residing in the underworld, far too many for Daimon's liking. Discovering which of them, if any, were behind everything would take too long. It was quicker to get their hands on the Wraith and make him talk. An ominous creaking noise drew Daimon's gaze to his left. His eyes tracked the jagged fault line spreading up the ice from a point where several demons were clawing at it. Was he imagining it, or were there even more demons now? "You guys got this," Valen said. "Sure." Daimon readied himself, shoring up the wall of ice, but aware it wouldn't hold, not against that many sets of claws. The demon's black blood streaked the clear ice, the foul stench of it filling the air. Disgust rolled through him and he curled his lip. Ares grunted in response from the right side of the pond as he slammed a demon into the pavement that encircled the water. "Good, because I'm not sure I can do this." Valen sounded tired now, and when Daimon fixed his senses on his violet-haired brother, he felt it too. "Not without a little more juice." Daimon looked back at him. Valen's golden eyes glittered, glowing in the light shining from the gate as he raised one of his blades. "No!" Ares snarled, pivoted towards him, and kicked off. He wouldn't make it. Neither would Daimon, not even if he stepped. All he could do was watch as Valen ran the blade across his wrist and blood gushed from the wound. "Stronzo!" Ava barked and lunged for him, her short black hair flying out of her face as she reached for the blade. Valen sagged as blood poured from his wrist, splattering across the surface of the gate and spreading outwards, and Ava grabbed him instead of the knife. She caught him as his knees gave out. He breathed hard from between gritted teeth, his eyes rapidly darkening as they narrowed. Ava muttered soft words in Italian, sweet, chastising ones coupled with a few strong swear words that Daimon decided his brother deserved. Valen leaned heavily on her slender shoulders, his arm shaking as he tried to keep holding it out over the gate. Ava took hold of his arm for him, helping him, and he looked at her, a hell of a lot of love in his eyes that was still strange to see. Valen's default setting for his entire life had been caustic, and it had only gotten worse in the centuries after their sister had died, and Zeus had punished Valen for his insubordination by removing his favor from him, leaving a ragged scar down the left side of Valen's face and neck, a permanent reminder of what he had done. So it was weird seeing his brother looking at someone with genuine warmth in his eyes, with love. The blood Valen was spilling onto the gate seeped across the surface, muting the colors. I think it's working, Valen slurred. Ava struggled to keep him on his feet. Daimon wasn't sure how their youngest brother, Callistos, was going to be able to handle closing the main gate in Seville, if closing London was draining Valen this much. Cal had been out of sorts since they had lost the chance to discover the location of his twin sister Calindria's soul, and Escher had disappeared. Cal was blaming himself for both of those things. Daimon doubted he was strong enough to handle closing Seville on top of all that. Valen cut off as he suddenly dropped, his knees hitting the bottom of the shallow pond, and Ava yelped as she was dragged down with him. Daimon looked at the gate as he called on his power, summoning one last wave of ice. It rose up around the inside of the wall, the shards only 7 feet tall, but enough to keep the demons at bay while Ares checked on Valen and the gate. A gate which Daimon could no longer feel, not as he could before. The power that flowed from it now was muted, barely there. Had Valen done it? The ring slowly began to shrink, the innermost one winking out of existence as it touched the central violet disk. It was closing. Is he good? Daimon hollered, keeping his focus on the wall of ice, aware the demons were still there and still trying to get to them. Ares looked up from his position, crouched next to Valen, and nodded. Think so. He's out cold, though. Daimon didn't like the sound of that. Closing the twin gate had been taxing on Cal, but he hadn't passed out. Ares pulled a phone from his pocket, the screen casting white highlights in his overlong tawny hair and across his face, as his thumb danced over the device. Calling in a retrieval. Because neither he nor Daimon could teleport with Valen without harming him. Ava tore the hem of her t-shirt and bound Valen's wrist, muttering obscenities in Italian under her breath the whole time. Beyond Ares, Valen, and Ava, the last ring of the gate shrank into the central disk. It shrank too and then disappeared with a violent flash. Gone. For now. Once the enemy was dead and the threat over, Hades would want the gates opened again. Their father had sent a messenger to Charis to say he had stopped all traffic through the gates, but had made it clear he couldn't keep the underworld closed for long. Gods, goddesses, and hellspawn didn't appreciate being caged in that realm, having their freedom taken from them. Hades' staff were already dealing with hundreds of complaints. Considering the alternative was them all losing their home and being ruled by whoever was behind this uprising. Daimon figured they could put up with their freedom being impacted a little. Daimon kept an eye on Valen as Ava tended to him, worry a constant weight in his heart, as his senses remained locked on the demons. They retreated into the night, but he kept his boots firmly planted where they were, resisting the urge to follow them and eradicate them all. Valen needed him here. The ice walls surrounding them were beginning to crack as Merrick appeared, black ribbons of smoke curling from the shoulders of his torn charcoal linen shirt, and onyx demon blood streaked across his face and darkening his wavy brown hair. His earthy eyes shimmered with green and gold flakes as he looked down at Valen where he lay in Ava's arms. Cal suffered the same fate. Daimon cast a glance at Ares. Concern etched hard lines on his older brother's face. Unease that ran through Daimon, too, as he thought about not one but two of their brothers out cold with no sign of coming around. If he had known closing a gate would cause this to happen, he would have spoken out against it rather than going along with it. The look on Aries' face said he wasn't sure what he would have said, and Daimon didn't envy him. Merrick looked just as conflicted as he stooped and lifted Valen into a fireman's carry over his shoulder. Daimon was glad he wasn't one of the oldest of their group. He felt the weight of responsibility enough as it was. He couldn't imagine how heavily it weighed upon Karis, Aries, and Merrick's shoulders. Karis was under enough pressure as it was, without having to order them to close the gates, knowing full well they would end up like Valen and Cal. Closing the gates was something they needed to do, but Daimon feared the cost of shutting them down was dangerously high. He only hoped he was wrong about that. Merrick held his hand out to Ava. Her blue eyes reluctantly shifted away from Valen and landed on it. She placed hers into it, and they both disappeared. Aries was quick to follow them. Daimon lingered, waiting for the ice walls to break because he wanted to be sure all evidence of their existence would be gone by morning, when mortals would enter Hyde Park. He didn't want them seeing anything out of place. That was the only reason he hadn't teleported. It had nothing to do with the sorceress who was probably waiting in Tokyo to give him hell. He scrubbed a hand over the spikes of his white hair, watching the ice begin to crumble. The ancient Edo period mansion felt far too small with her staying in it, but when he had suggested she bunk elsewhere, Cass had been quick to launch into an argument with him. Her ward, Marinda, was staying in the mansion with Cal since the London townhouse that was his home had been breached by Eli and the enemy, which meant Cass had decided she was also staying in Tokyo, right under Daimon's feet. Daimon rubbed the back of his neck and huffed. The sorceress had a bad habit of just deciding things and no one got a say in them. Daimon had been staying in Tokyo to take care of the mansion, which was primarily Escher's home now, although their father had built it for all of them, and so he could be there for Aiko. Aiko was devastated by Escher's disappearance, and Daimon needed to look after her for his brother. He was doing his best, but some days were harder than others. Some days, Daimon's dark thoughts and fears about his brother weighed too heavily on him, and he couldn't face her or anyone. His phone vibrated, and he didn't bother to check the message that had come in. It would be from Karis asking him where he was. He focused on the wall, raised his hand, and curled it into a fist. When he squeezed it, the ice shattered, and Daimon stepped. Darkness whirled around him, cool and comforting, a connection to the underworld that he savored, and then his boots hit gravel. He opened his eyes and looked at the mansion, aching inside. It felt empty without Escher in it, even when all his brothers and their women were there, crowding the long main room of the single-story horseshoe-shaped building. Morning sunlight reflected off the glazed gray ribbed tiles of the roof and brightened the white panels that filled the spaces between thick, dark wooden beams. It warmed his back, casting his shadow out before him, across the gravel and the stepping stones, to the base of one of the large stone lanterns that were dotted around the front garden. From inside, voices rang out, a cacophony that had him wanting to teleport to his own home in Hong Kong to get some peace and quiet, and avoid the owner of the angry female voice that for some damned reason he picked out from the blur. "You should have taken me with you. Now look what happened. I could have helped," Cass snapped, her words harsh and clipped, bringing out her Russian accent as they rang with the fury he could sense coming from her. Karis didn't respond to that. He carried Cal towards the right side of the mansion, disappearing from view with Marinda hurrying behind him. Cass turned, her pale blue eyes tracking her ward, a worried edge to them that almost made him feel there was a warm heart somewhere beneath that irritating, haughty exterior of hers. Daimon forced himself to walk to the front porch, stepped up onto the raised wooden deck as he toed his boots off, and steeled himself only a little before entering the house. As expected, Cass's eyes immediately leaped to him. He cursed when he realized they were alone. She strode towards him, the thigh slit in her long black dress flashing a lot of creamy flesh at him. He swore she never took the damn thing off. Would it kill her to wear something less revealing, less figure-hugging? The soft black material embraced ample breasts and a small waist, and flared over curvy hips. It flashed every inch of her and made it impossible not to notice things about her. Things he didn't want to notice. Before she could open her mouth to launch her first salvo, he held his hand up and strode past her. "Not interested." Daimon made a beeline for the garden nestled between the three sides of the house. needing air and some space because he felt as if he was drowning. Had been feeling that way since Cass had come crashing into their lives. He couldn't get a moment alone, and gods, he needed a moment to breathe. Cass stepped into his path, the flare of anger in her ice-blue eyes rapidly fading into something far worse. Concern. She gave him a once-over. "Those wounds need looking at." She pointed to his chest and then his legs, and he had never been more aware of his own body as he was whenever she was gazing at it. "I'm not in the mood for you, Cass. Just leave me alone." He stepped past her, heading for the garden and the air he badly needed. Space to rein his riotous feelings back under his control. Needs he had no right to feel. "Daimon, wait." She started after him again. Wanting to be sure she got the message and left him alone, he turned on her with a growl as his feet hit the wooden planks of the covered walkway that ran around all three wings of the house. "I don't have time for this right now. Escher is still missing. I'm tired and injured, and we don't know when or where the enemy will attack next, and I need to take care of Valen." Cass inched back a step with each harsh word he threw at her. It wasn't like the sorceress to shrink away from someone, especially him. "I just want to help," she bit out, a little too sulkily for him to not feel anything other than like a royal dick. "Let me help with Valen." "Fine," he muttered, and took some of the bite out of his tone as he added, "I'd appreciate that." He turned to his right towards the southern wing of the house where Valen's quarters were. Cass murmured, "It wouldn't kill you to let me help you too." He knew that, but he couldn't. He needed to keep his distance from her. He'd made a promise. He drew his long black coat back and slipped his right hand into his pocket and clutched the pendant hanging from his phone. A promise he intended to keep. Chapter 2. Cassandra could feel Daimon withdrawing, pulling away from her as he turned his back to her and strode towards the wing of the house where she had been sleeping in Karis's room. She wanted to push him, wanted to know why he did that. He changed so frequently she couldn't keep up. One moment he would be lashing out at her verbally, as scathing as could be, and the next he softened and accepted her presence, would even go as far as speaking with her as if she was a normal human being, not something he wanted to wipe from the face of the earth. She remained where she was on the covered walkway, staring after him, trying to make sense of him and feeling as if she would never understand him. The temptation to follow him was great, especially when rather than entering Valen's room that was directly in front of her, he banked right and headed towards the garden instead. Cass held herself back, because he needed space. It hadn't taken her long into her study of him and his brothers to notice that he was closest to Escher, and it had taken her less than a second to see how deep that love ran when Escher had leapt into the gate in pursuit of the wraith. Or perhaps it had taken her longer than that. In the short time since Escher had been missing, she had witnessed a dramatic change in Daimon. It was as if he was slowly falling apart before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. There was nothing anyone could do to stop it. He wasn't going to be whole again until Escher returned. What happened if he never came back? It wasn't any of her concern, and neither was Daimon's state of mind. The reason she had studied these gods, and the reason she was here now, was for Miranda's sake, and to keep the vow she had made to Miranda's father, Eric, who had been murdered by the brother's enemy. A promise to keep Mari safe. That was her priority. Daimon was just a nice distraction, a bit of eye candy that brightened things up while she was keeping an eye on her ward. He was nothing to her, just some harmless fun. He couldn't be anything more than that. Her gaze drifted after him, and she idly tracked him as he crossed the arched vermilion and black wooden bridge that spanned the koi pond at the start of the lush rolling garden. He paused at the apex of it and gazed down into the water, his profile to her, too far away for her to make out any details. Not that she needed to be close to him to know how he would look. Lost, adrift, hurt, lonely. It was none of her business. These gods meant nothing to her. Daimon meant nothing to her. She had to remember that, had to remember her duty, even when it felt like a sword hanging over her, ready to fall and sever her from her life, throwing her into servitude that grated and had her mood blackening whenever she thought about it. Cass pulled down a breath and purged it and all her feelings. When she was calm again, as empty as she could manage, All her worries and desires washed from her, she padded barefoot towards Valen's room. Ava looked up as Cass entered the sparsely furnished room, her blue eyes filled with concern and fear. It was strange seeing the assassin afraid of something. Cass shifted her gaze to Valen, where he lay on top of a pile of blankets in the center of the golden tatami mats that covered the floor, his violet hair in disarray, but his face peaceful. Beside him, Ava tightened her grip on his left hand, clutching it as if she feared he would slip away if she let go. Cass eased down to kneel on the other side of him and looked him over. Someone had bandaged his right arm from his elbow to his palm. Crimson spotted it, a rather nasty patch of it over his wrist. She started there, holding her right hand over it as she closed her eyes and formed the words in her mind, a powerful incantation that would speed his healing process. Heat bloomed in her hand, and Ava's soft gasp rang in her ears as light shimmered from her palm. As she was funneling the healing spell into Valen, she probed a little, using another incantation to study his vitals. There was nothing out of the ordinary on the surface, but as she summoned stronger magic to delve deeper, she wanted to bite out a rather unladylike curse. This wasn't good. She needed to speak with Mari. Cass withdrew her hand and met Ava's blue gaze. She wasn't sure what to say to the mortal, just as she was never sure what to say to Daimon or to Aiko, Escher's lover. She stared at her in silence, searching for the words that wouldn't come. When the silence began to grate, she pushed onto her feet and forced a smile and a slight nod.
"He will be fine."
Did those words ring with the hollowness she felt in them? It was the right thing to say, but it felt wrong of her to utter those 4 words, offering hope where she wasn't sure there was any. Perhaps that was the reason she never knew what to say to Daimon or Aiko. She couldn't bring herself to lie to them to make them feel better. She hurried from the room, striding straight across the front of the main living area of the house to the other wing of it. She turned right at the end of the corridor, passing the TV area, and her pulse picked up as she neared Cal's room. Mari was quick to stand as she entered, her blue-green eyes bright with unshed tears, and her golden hair falling down from the twisted plait that arched over the top of her head. She ran her hand over it again as she hurried to Cass, hope surfacing in her eyes. Cass caught her arm and pulled her towards the door, aware of the other 2 gods in the room with Cal standing over him. Karis and Ares, 2 men she had discovered were formidable in their desire to protect their younger brothers, and in their ability to fight. What she wanted to tell Mari was liable to spark both of those things in them.
"Mari,"
she whispered, hoping the gods wouldn't hear her.
"I think Cal is going to be sleeping for a while."
"How do you know that?" Karis's deep voice was calm, emotionless, dangerous. When the firstborn of Hades sounded like this, he was a step away from unleashing hell upon someone. In this case, her. She looked at him, refusing to let him see that what she really wanted to do was mutter her strongest barrier spell and distance herself from him. Because he wasn't going to like what she had to say, and like his father, he had a tendency to shoot the messenger.
"I used a spell on Valen to probe a little into his physical condition."
She braced herself for his reaction. But it was Daimon who was suddenly beside her, his voice a black snarl as he advanced on her. "You did what?" She stood her ground, stoked her courage, and squared up to him.
"You said I could heal him. I just wanted to see what damage I was dealing with so I could find the appropriate spells."
She didn't take her eyes away from his icy blue ones. They were rapidly brightening, turning white ringed with navy, sparks of silver lighting them as the anger she could sense in him mounted. "Did you hurt him with that little probing spell of yours? Because I didn't give you permission to do that," Daimon snapped, and Cass wanted to bark right back at him, but she kept her temper in check. Because she had been wrong about these brothers, had judged them without knowing them. But if she had been quick to do such a thing, it had only been because she felt protective of Mirinda. Now that she had seen Cal with Mirinda, she could see that Eric had been right to trust the god, and that Cal clearly loved her. And she knew it must have been a comfort to Eric in his last moment. He had seen a vision of the future, and in it he had seen his daughter would find someone who loved her as deeply as he had loved her mother. All the brothers were like Eric in that way. When they loved, they loved. No half measures. It was a forever kind of love, whether it was for their family or for a woman. Gods, She was being sentimental. Love was just love. There was nothing magical about it. It wasn't necessary. She stared into Daimon's icy eyes, feeling nothing. Not fear, not love, not hate. He was just a distraction, a pleasant diversion, one who looked ready to throttle her. She risked a glance at Karis and Ares and found them looking the same way. "Listen," she bit out, before they could turn on her or Daimon could get ideas about attempting to drown her in the pond again.
Valen is in a deep sleep. One might call it a coma. He sealed the gate. Did you honestly think there wouldn't be consequences from tampering with something bound to you all in blood? Created from your blood?
Ares scrubbed a hand down his face, his deep brown eyes filled with fatigue and worry. Karis actually looked concerned for once as his green gaze dropped to Cal, where he was tucked under the covers on the floor. "Check him," Karis said. "See if they both feel the same way to you." She kneeled beside Cal, took hold of his wrist, and closed her eyes as she summoned the spell again, pushing past her own fatigue to make it as strong as the one she had used on Valen. Her strength drained from her as she funneled it into him and waited. He was hurting, so she gave his healing a little push as she had with Valen. And then she felt it, the same feeling Valen had given her.
"He's asleep," she murmured, holding the connection between them open. "A coma-level sleep. He's still functioning normally, but I can feel this isn't a normal sleep. When will he wake up?"
Mari's voice trembled and Cass broke her hold on Cal and looked up at her. For once, she didn't hide her feelings. Let Mari see them all. She knew what Mari was really asking but was too afraid to voice. Would he wake up? She pushed onto her feet and gathered Mari into her arms, holding her close.
"I'm not sure. It might be a few days, sweetie. It might be a few weeks."
She refused to say it might be never. She couldn't do that to Mari.
"At worst, he might not wake until the seals are removed from the gate," she said.
"I don't like the sound of that." The sense of dark power Karis constantly emanated grew in strength, and Cass had a hard time withstanding it in her weakened state. She leaned on Mari, hoping her ward wouldn't notice it, or if she did, wouldn't mention that she was weak from using her magic on gods. She didn't want these gods to know that she had her limits. "I don't like it either," Daimon muttered. "We can't afford to leave the gates open, but we can't weaken our side by having two more of our team out of action." Ares folded his arms across his broad chest, causing the tattered remains of his black t-shirt to stretch over his muscles. Mari whispered,
"Cal closed the gate. How can anyone else open it?"
Cass smoothed her hand over Mari's fair hair, hoping it would comfort her. "We could probably use their blood," Daimon offered from behind her. "It might be enough to allow another of us to undo the wards." "We should wait." Karis leveled a dark look at Daimon. "Don't give me that look. I'm only talking about waiting a few days to see if their condition changes. Valen and Cal will need to recover from the blood loss of sealing the Seville gate anyway. A few days, and then we shall decide what to do." Cass hoped for all their sakes that Cal and Valen awoke. The air in the room remained dark, oppressive, as the three brothers stood in silence. They were already missing one brother. Having another two out of action was an understandable cause of worry. Daimon broke the silence. "If we're going to be out of action for weeks, weakened by draining our blood to close the gates, then we're going to be vulnerable to the enemy. Maybe this is all part of their plan." She pulled back from Mari and looked at him, catching the concern in his ice-blue eyes as he ran a hand over the spikes of his dirty white hair, concern that echoed inside her, too. "What if they're forcing us to close the gates, so we're concentrating the power of them into only a few, making them harder to manage? They could be setting us up for a fall." Daimon exchanged a look with his brothers, one that chilled her blood. What he was saying made a dreadful sort of sense. They had planned to close 4 gates as quickly as possible, but with this new turn of events, that would be too risky. As it was, there were still 5 gates in need of protection, and only 4 brothers to do it. If the enemy attacked now, her side would be at a disadvantage. "We'll have to be on our guard." Karis lifted his green gaze from Cal and settled it on her. "Can we count on you?" Daimon's gaze drilled into the side of her face, and she suppressed the urge to point out they could have counted on her tonight, When they had gone to London and Seville, rather than throwing it in their faces again, she nodded, looked at Karis and Ares, and then right into Daimon's eyes.
Whatever you need from me, you've got it.
Chapter 3. Daimon trod the well-worn path that trailed through the garden in the gap between the north wing of the mansion and the white wall that enclosed it, enjoying the cool shade and the peace, and maybe the escape from the gloomy air inside the house. It had been 3 days since Cal and Valen had sealed 2 of the gates, and in that time Daimon and his remaining brothers had been fighting demons away from the gates each night. The Erinyes had targeted 2 or 3 gates a night, starting the opening process using the power they had stolen from Mirinda, and then disappearing just as he and his brothers reached the gate, leaving them with hordes of demons to deal with as they closed the gate again. Everyone was tired and beaten down, and he wasn't talking about just his brothers. Katerina, Ava, and Cass had been on the front line with them, battling the demons, working as a team to help him and his brothers in the absence of Cal, Valen, and Escher. Daimon had the feeling that the enemy was trying to weaken them, or maybe they were testing the limits of their powers. His side was testing the limits of the Erinyes' powers in return. Karis had asked Mirinda to avoid touching Cal so they could see whether her power over the gate would weaken, and could discover how long a Fury could hold on to a power they had siphoned from another. Whenever Daimon went to check on Cal, he could see how difficult this was for Mirinda. Cal was still sleeping, and it was clear she wanted to hold him, to touch him and offer comfort, and she couldn't. He could understand how that felt. He couldn't touch his brothers to give them that either. His touch would only cause them more pain. Daimon neared the front garden, tipped his head back, and stared at the endless blue sky. Gods, he was tired. Bone-deep tired. Whenever he tried to sleep, he saw visions of Escher in the underworld, terrible things that plagued him when he woke, stayed with him through the night as he carried out his duties until dawn came and sleep beckoned again. He had woken 2 hours ago in a cold sweat and had been walking the garden ever since, seeking some respite, trying to purge what he had seen in his nightmares, desperate to sleep and get some rest this time. As he rounded the corner and the path opened up again, shaded by a beautiful old maple tree on his left and bushes on his right, his gaze landed on the 2 motorbikes Cal had brought with him from his home in London after Karis had declared it a loss and ordered him to move into the mansion in Tokyo. The lime green and black one was sleek and sharp, built for speed, just like his little brother. The gold and black one beside it looked closer to a normal road bike. Escher was going to flip his shit when he came home and found them parked on the gravel of the front garden. He shook his head, could easily picture it playing out, and how Cal would attempt to defuse the situation and probably only make things worse. Daimon would be the one to talk Escher down, and in the end his brother would reluctantly agree to the bike staying, but would want them moved to a place where they wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of the garden he loved so much. Daimon paused on a stepping stone, his eyes drifting over the front of the mansion, tracing the line of the roof where it swept over the porch and the contrast of the slate-gray tiles against the blue sky. The single-story house was enormous, but it felt too small with Cass in it. He couldn't seem to escape her. The only time he was safe from the sorceress was when he was with Aiko, trying to keep her spirits and his up. Cass didn't seem to know how to respond to Aiko, usually made herself scarce when it all became too much for the young Japanese woman and she broke down. If it weren't for the fact Daimon had seen how much Cass cared about Mirinda, he would have thought Cass was the one with a cold heart. But it was him. He knew that. He had closed it off long ago, had hardened himself and pushed away everyone except his family. He didn't want to feel anything, not anymore. His heart was ice now, no trace of feeling left in it. It was ice now. He told himself that as Cass appeared on the porch, drawing his gaze to her. She wiped her hands on a cloth, looking like a bizarre combination of housewife and glamorous jet-setter. Her long black dress that hugged her curves like a second skin, her polished onyx nails and perfectly preened tumbling waves of her jet hair were all at odds with the dirty rag she held. Her aquamarine eyes settled on him, not piercing, not probing, not anything. But her presence still rankled him. "What's your problem?" he snapped, unable to keep the bite out of his voice or stop himself from reacting to her. She arched a fine black eyebrow at him and tipped her chin up in that haughty way that made him want to snarl at her.
"Good morning to you, too,"
she said, her tone whisper soft, her words lashing at him. He hated it when she did that, responding to him in a civilized manner when he couldn't bring himself to be the same towards her. He couldn't help it. He was constantly on his guard around her, and it was her fault. She had made it clear more than enough times that she was determined to strip down his walls, and he had made it clear he was determined she wouldn't. So now they were at war, locked in a battle he was going to win. She lowered the cloth to her side and smoothed her glossy black hair, luring his gaze back to her face. He cursed her, and then he cursed her again when she spoke.
"Aiko made some food for those of us whose sleep eludes, and I just wanted to tell you."
She looked down at the rag she held. For a moment, he thought she would leave it at that and leave him alone, but then she lifted her head and locked gazes with him.
"You need to eat."
Those words were stern, commanding, irritating. "I don't need to eat." His stomach grumbled, calling him a liar. Fine, he did need to eat, but he had no appetite. He stood there, 1,000 thoughts and feelings colliding inside him, and the weight on his shoulders felt too heavy to bear. He was drowning again. He tried to hold back the tide, looked away from her thinking that was a good place to start, but he ended up staring at the mansion. The weight on his shoulders dropped right through him, tore a gaping hole inside him as he remembered all the good times, before everything had gone to hell. He absently lifted his hand and rubbed the aching spot above his heart.
"If you need to talk—"
He cut Cass off with a vicious snarl, baring emerging fangs at her. "If I need to talk, it won't be you that I'm talking to. I'm fine."
"You're not fine."
She took a hard step towards the edge of the porch, her eyes glittering like ice as she narrowed them on him.
"I haven't known you long, but it's obvious you share a bond with Escher. And with Escher—"
"Escher is coming back." He cut her off again, that hole inside him filling with acid that scoured his insides, with darkness and pain, and despair. His voice dropped to a whisper, losing all strength as it all crashed over him. "He'll come back. He has to come back." Cass was mercifully silent for a moment, but then she softly murmured,
"What if he doesn't?"
He stepped, darkness swirling around him for a heartbeat before he appeared right in front of her. Her breath hitched, her entire body tensing as if she anticipated a strike against her, as if she believed he would hit her. A low growl curled from him, birthed by the thought she believed him capable of such a thing. He drew a steadying breath to calm the raging torrent of his feelings, lifted his right hand and hovered it over the front of her throat. He stared at it, at the smooth, pale column of it that was stark against the black of his gloves. "You're playing with ice, Koldunya," he whispered low, his gaze transfixed on her throat and the frost forming on his gloves, fascination rolling through him as he felt the warmth of her against his palm, despite the gap of air between them. "If you're not careful, one of these days you're going to find out what it's like to be touched by me." She murmured sexily.
"Is that a promise?"
His eyes leaped to meet hers, shock rolling through him as he saw in them that she wanted it to be, that she wanted him to touch her. Need flooded him, a fierce hunger that had him close to inching his hand forwards to make contact. He shut it down, backed off. Disappointment flickered in her eyes. For some damned reason, it echoed inside him, too. He was disappointed with himself. That was all it was. He had promised his heart to another, and Cass was just someone the Moirai had sent to test him. She was nothing to him. He didn't want her. He didn't need her. He backed off another step, ignoring the cold abyss that opened inside him as he distanced himself from the sorceress. This was what he wanted, this distance between them, this coldness. This was what Penelope would want from him and what he owed the woman he had loved and lost. She deserved his faithfulness. He was devoted to her, and nothing would change that. He didn't want another female. He would always be loyal to her. These needs growing inside him were inconsequential. All that mattered was remaining true to Penelope. He didn't need a woman. He didn't want one. A growl rose up his throat when an image flickered in his mind, his brother Ares softly touching Megan's cheek, a wealth of love in his eyes as their skin made contact. He shut it out. He didn't need that. He didn't want that. It was a blessing that his touch was ice, liable to give pain rather than pleasure. It was a blessing. It was. His heart was constant, forever Penelope's. He was constant. He was. Miranda appeared behind Cass, her tropical blue eyes shimmering with tears.
Carl's awake.
Cass's face warmed as she turned to Miranda, her soft rosy lips curling in a smile, as her aquamarine eyes brightened with love and happiness. Gods, she was beautiful. That thought hit him like a gorgon, striking so hard and fast out of the blue that he actually took a step back to brace himself. He stared at Cass, reeling, stunned by how she had made him feel with only a smile. He watched her go inside, too shaken to follow as his mind whirled. He wasn't looking for a woman. Penelope was the only woman he would ever love. But as he stared after Cass, drawn to following her, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying to himself, that he had been lying to himself for years, and that was why he constantly felt as if he was drowning. Cassandra was forcing him to face the truth, that he was lonely, and to protect himself from the pain of that loneliness, he had convinced himself that he was being noble, that he still loved Penelope, and that being loyal to her was vital to him. The real reason he was always on edge around Cass, always quick to anger and fast to lash out at her verbally to drive her away, hit him like a thunderbolt. He wasn't angry with her because he felt she was trying to destroy his loyalty to Penelope, attempting to steal him from her. He was angry because he wanted Cass. He looked down at his gloved hands, lifted them palm up before him, and watched the frost flowers blooming across the black leather. And he couldn't have her. Chapter 4. Daimon cringed as Valen hollered an obscenity across the main living room of the house, launching it like a missile at Cal as he flipped him off. He had been pleased when his brothers had regained consciousness, but now he was beginning to wish they had stayed asleep. At least the mansion had been quiet then. Karis had mistakenly ordered the two of them to rest, and they had spent the last 2 days on the cream couches in the TV area, dressed in sweatpants and worn t-shirts, lounging and playing video games, and fighting whenever one of them won. "You sure you can't go home yet?" Daimon aimed it at Valen, who shifted his hand to flash his extended middle finger at him, too. "Captain's orders," Valen grinned and waggled his finger. "You're stuck with me." "You seem well enough to go home," he grumbled as he picked up several empty discarded packets of potato chips and shook his head at the number of juice glasses occupying the coffee table. He swore Valen and Cal used a fresh glass every time they wanted a drink. Valen fake swooned, pressing the back of his right hand against his forehead as he sagged back against the couch cushions, still hammering buttons on the black controller with his left hand. "I'm sick, man. Have a heart." The television announced a winner. "Shit, kid, I can beat you one-handed." Valen pressed his bare left foot against Cal's shoulder where he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by popcorn and broken chips. "Fuck off." Cal grabbed Valen's ankle and shoved his foot away. "Your stinky feet are putting me off my game." Daimon pretended to check an invisible watch on his wrist. "You guys have around a minute before Ava and Miranda get back from the store." He cast a pointed look at the mess surrounding his brothers. "Is this the impression you want to make on them?" He shook his head. "Reckon they'll think you're both losers and dump your arses." Valen and Cal were on their feet in a heartbeat, Cal rushing to the kitchen for a dustpan and brush, while Valen bundled the glasses and bowls into his arms, spilling more food onto the table and floor. Daimon made a mental note to threaten them with their women thinking they were losers in the future, whenever the two of them were being annoying. It was a great motivator. Cal paused halfway through sweeping the floor, his shoulders going rigid beneath his khaki t-shirt. "They're here." He raised his hand and the air in the room shifted, swirling into a miniature tempest that gathered all the mess into the pan for him. "Cheater," Valen muttered as he rushed to the kitchen with another load of dishes. "If I used my powers, Escher would kill you." Daimon didn't let him finish that sentence, because Valen could command lightning and had come close to incinerating the mansion enough times already. He didn't want his brother getting ideas about using his power to any degree within the vicinity of it. Valen sobered, shrugged stiffly. "Wasn't going to do anything." If his brother had tacked spoil sport onto that sentence, it wouldn't have made him sound any sulkier. Daimon dragged a hand down his face and sighed as he prayed for strength. He wasn't cut out for this. Escher was meant to be the one in charge at the mansion, not him. He definitely wasn't cut out to stand in for Karis or even Ares. The two of them should have been here taking care of things, but Ares had gone to pack some things for Megan so they could move into the mansion, and Karis was busy doing something. The gods only knew what. His brother was becoming more and more secretive. Daimon had a feeling that was not a good thing. The front door opened and Cass's scent of magic and sin hit him hard. Had his gaze straying towards her despite his effort to keep his focus fixed on what he was doing. Ava stared at the stack of empty wrappers in his hand, and then her blue eyes shot to Valen, her black eyebrows lowering above them. Her Italian accent was sharp as she said,
Did you eat all of that when you knew we were getting food?
Valen pointed at Daimon. He ate it. I told him not to, but you should see him carb load. It's impressive. These gods, thinking they can eat what they want and not put on a single pound. Well, when he gets fat, I'll have to say that I told him so. Ava didn't look as if she was buying it. For a split second, Cass did. Daimon scowled at her and stomped towards the kitchen. Like I'd eat this crap. He shoved the wrappers into the bin, turned back towards the living room, and froze. Cass stood in the doorway, clutching a dark glass bottle that had silver scrollwork and bands overlaid onto it. She gave him a painfully slow once-over.
Your body is a temple.
He narrowed his eyes, daring her to say anything more than that. With a wicked, saucy smile, she murmured,
What I wouldn't give to worship it.
He huffed, glaring at her. You worship the god, not the temple.
Oh, I could worship you. You just have to stop fighting me.
She set the bottle down on the counter. Not gonna happen. He stepped towards her, but she stood her ground, blocking the exit. If he wanted to get past her, he would have to move her, and the victorious glimmer in her eyes said she knew he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't risk touching her. He stepped up to her, raised his hands, and planted them against the doorframe on either side of her head as she leaned back to avoid contact with him. Can't worship what you can't touch. He lowered his hands and stepped, appearing on the other side of the doorway.
That's what you think,
Cass whispered. He frowned over his shoulder at her, wanted to ask what she meant by that. The look in her eyes as she casually flicked her long fall of wavy black hair over her bare shoulders challenged him to do it, so he let it roll off his back instead. Or at least tried to. It plagued him as Merrick appeared with Katerina, and then Ares appeared holding Megan to him a split second later, as if they had all sensed the bounty the women had brought into the house and wanted their share of it. Aiko busied herself with setting the cartons in the white plastic bags out in a line down the middle of the long mahogany dining table, passing comments with Megan and Ava as they set some plates out. He was glad Ava and Miranda had proposed getting takeout, giving Aiko something to do with them. She needed a moment of normal, a brief reprieve from the pain. They all did. Ares fussed over Megan, helping her down onto some cushions, and Megan swatted at him, trying to stop him. Daimon fixed his focus elsewhere, helping Aiko open the containers, and using a spoon to smack Valen on the back of his hand when he tried to steal a piece of chicken. Valen glared at him, noticed Ava was watching, and clutched his hand to his chest. Did you see what the mean god did to me, baby? The mean god will do more than that if you try to steal more food. Daimon gathered the lids of the containers.
I might help him.
Ava smiled when Valen scowled at her. He raised his hand and clawed at his black t-shirt over his heart. She wounds me when I'm sick. Sick is your default setting, Ares muttered. Valen huffed. Whatever. No one loves me. I get it. He rolled his shoulders and pouted. Ava sidled over to him, planted her hands to his chest, and leaned in close, so their black clothes blended together. She gazed up into his golden eyes.
I love you,
she whispered. Valen clammed up, averted his gaze, might have even blushed. Everyone noticed the shift in the air around him, how it went from playful to awkward in the blink of an eye, but it was Ares who had the balls to jump on it. Don't tell me you haven't told her you love her yet. Ares straightened, shook his head, and issued Valen one hell of an unimpressed look as he sighed.
He hasn't.
Ava shrugged, a playful edge to it. I have, Valen bit out. and tiny arcs of electricity sparked around his fingers. He glared at each of them in turn as everyone stared at him, none of them looking as if they believed that. "I fucking have." "When?" Ava turned a curious look on Valen. He looked at his feet and grumbled, "First time you told me." She frowned, her lips flattening, and was silent for a few seconds before she said,
"When you covered my ears and spoke—"
"You told her in the language of the underworld?" Merrick cuffed Valen around the back of his head, causing the long lengths of his violet hair to shoot forwards and fall over his face. Valen swept them back. "So what? I still said it." "Say it so she can hear it." Cal shoved Valen at Ava. Valen growled, his golden eyes rapidly brightening, and looked as if he wanted to attack them all. But then he sighed, shifted foot to foot, and muttered, "I love you too." Ava bit back a smile. Ares and Merrick groaned. Cal sighed. "What?" Valen looked at them all in turn, shrugging his shoulders as he raised his hands at his sides. "Not good enough?" Valen huffed. "Fine." He grabbed Ava's wrist, pulled her into his arms, and brought his lips to her ear as he closed his eyes. He whispered, "I fucking love you. You know that, right?" Ava wrapped her arms around him and plowed her fingers into the choppy sides of his hair.
"I do. Fucking love you too."
Valen kissed her hard and disappeared in a swirl of black smoke. Cal waved his hand through the vapor trail of the teleport and grinned. "That's him gone for 2 minutes. I say we eat it all before he gets back." Daimon sank into his seat that almost resembled a Western dining chair with the legs cut off, the wooden seat sitting directly on the tatami mats with a cushion on top of it, and the low back offering him some comfort. It had taken months to convince Escher to switch from just cushions to this more modern type of Japanese dining chair, but every one of his brothers had thanked him when Daimon had succeeded. He crossed his legs and tried to shut out the crazy that was his family as he ate. Valen actually took close to 7 minutes to reappear, his cheeks flushed and eyes glowing gold. He settled Ava onto his lap, ran his tongue up her neck, which had her murmuring something about the stud that pierced it, and then fed her, all of which Daimon also chose to ignore. Karis arrived just as the meal was finishing, a distant edge to his emerald eyes. "What's up?" Ares came out of the kitchen with a fresh glass of water and set it down in front of Megan. "I want to test something." Karis idly spun the silver ring on his thumb with his index finger. Not a good sign. Karis had a bad habit of doing that when he was troubled by something. Was that why he had disappeared on them, going AWOL again? Ares had told them all not to worry, but it was hard not to when the enemy could attack at any moment, targeting the gates. Or one of them. Karis was powerful, but he was vulnerable when alone. It was about time his brother realized that, before something bad happened to him. "What do you want to test?" Ares said. Not a single ounce of emotion touched Karis's eyes as he lowered them to Mirinda. "Her." Mirinda didn't hesitate. She stood, neatened her mulberry woolen sweater, nervously smoothing it over her blue jeans, and met Karis's gaze.
"What do you want me to do?"
"We'll take you to the Tokyo Gate and see if you can open it. If you can, then we'll come back here and wait another few days before trying again." Karis finally stopped playing with his ring, drew the 2 sides of his long black coat back, and slipped his hands into the pockets of his pressed black slacks. "I'll go with you." Cal stood, and his blonde eyebrows knitted hard above stormy blue eyes when Karis shook his head. "No. Both you and Valen will stay here. Ava, too." Karis didn't budge an inch when Valen growled at him. "You're benching me?" Valen barked. "You're still recovering," Ares said, a sharp edge to his voice. "And someone has to stay here to protect Megan and Aiko." Valen's golden eyes lost their spark as he leaned back in his seat, folded his arms across his chest, and grunted, "Fine." His older brother could pretend he was in a mood about being told to stay put, but Daimon could see straight through it to the truth. Valen was honored that Ares wanted him to protect Megan and Aiko. "I need to go, too." Air swirled around Cal, teasing the tips of his blonde ponytail. "You need to stay here." Karis placed a hand on his shoulder and gently gripped it as he looked down into Cal's eyes. "We are only going to do a little testing. We shall not be long." That didn't allay the fear building in Cal, shining in his stormy irises. Daimon nodded towards Morinda. I'll keep an eye on her. Cass stood, brushed down her dress, and tipped her shoulders back.
Nothing will happen to Mari on my watch. You have my word on that, Callistos.
It grated that Cal hadn't looked relieved when Daimon had sworn to keep an eye on the woman he loved, but he had when Cass had made her promise. Cass was powerful, but she had her vulnerabilities. He couldn't be the only one of them who had noticed that her magic tapped her out, draining her of strength, leaving her as weak as a mortal if she used too much of it. Ares helped Megan onto her feet, and his eyebrows furrowed as he gazed lovingly down at her.
Oh, stop coddling. Even when you're not coddling, you're coddling.
Megan huffed, and pushed at Ares' broad chest, but he stood firm, not moving an inch. Her hand lingered, her touch softening to a caress as she looked up into his dark eyes.
I'll be peachy.
She didn't look as if she believed that.
You'll be peachy too, right?
So that was the reason behind her worry. She was afraid something would happen to Ares. Ares lowered his hand to her swollen belly and pressed his palm against it, splaying his fingers out. She dropped hers to cover his, and a smile wobbled on her lips. I'll just be a few minutes, and I'll be careful. He dropped a kiss on her forehead, one she leaned into as she closed her eyes. I'll be back before you know it. He smoothed the fingers of his other hand over her brown hair, skimming it down to the tips at her shoulders, and then tangled his hand in it and pulled her to him for a kiss. Daimon looked away. His eyes landed on Cass. She frowned at him, and he had the terrible feeling she was trying to pick apart his feelings. He wanted to tell her not to do it.
And then we can all have a glass of ambrosia,
Cass said. Everyone stared at her.
Well, everyone except Megan, since she's pregnant.
Cass looked at her.
Sorry, no ambrosia for you.
Ambrosia. That was what she had in that bottle with the silver filigree on it. Ooh, ambrosia. Valen rubbed his hands together, causing tiny sparks to leap from them. Where did you get ambrosia? Daimon put in, holding her gaze. Her right shoulder lifted slightly, a coy edge to her smile as she said,
I have my sources.
Meaning she had a dealer. He jerked his chin towards the others in the room with them. Ambrosia isn't for mortals.
Good thing that I'm not mortal.
Her blue eyes flashed fire at him, warning him he wasn't going to dissuade her, at least not easily.
Just a sip. You could have one now for courage if you need it.
She pretended she was going to turn to get the bottle and then looked back at him. Why was she pushing this? He rolled his eyes when it hit him. She was trying to get him drunk. This was her new method of attempting to break down his walls. He shook his head. Not going to happen.
Keris will have a drink, won't you, Keris?
She smiled sweetly at his older brother, and for some reason Daimon felt a powerful need to flash fangs and snarl at him. Keris just arched a black eyebrow at her and stepped, leaving ribbons of black swirling in the air behind him. Valen raised his hand. I'll drink with you. Ares loosed a deep sigh. Why doesn't that surprise me? Getting drunk, Valen? I thought you were sick. I'm feeling a little better. Valen shrugged. I could handle a shot or two. Cass pouted.
I don't feel like drinking anymore. You're no fun.
She aimed that at Daimon, but Valen answered. I'm more fun than you can handle. That earned him a smack around the back of his head from Ava. He looked at her as she wriggled off his lap, caught her around the waist as she twisted away from him and pulled her back onto it. I don't want to play with the bitch witch, baby. Let's wait till she's gone and then sneak some ambrosia from the bottle and get wicked.
The bottle is sealed with a spell.
Cass tipped her chin up, and Valen reacted like she had announced the end of the world was coming. Daimon looked out at the garden, which it probably was. The other world flashed over the present. The future of this world should he and his brothers fail in their mission. The Moirai had made sure they knew what fate awaited the realms if the enemy won, taunted them with visions of it. Beyond the crumbling walls of the mansion, buildings burned, the sky blazed orange, and harrowing screams cut through the thick, smoky air. Many in this world believed the underworld was hell. Hell was what awaited both this world and his one if he and his brothers failed. It doesn't look great, does it? Valen sobered, his deep voice turning serious as he stared in the direction Daimon was. It got better a little while ago, but now it's worse. I figured we were winning. Now I'm not sure. Cal sounded worried. Merrick gripped his shoulder. We're winning. It's in a state of limbo right now. We just need to score another victory and it will get better again. You'll see. Cal looked up at him and nodded. Daimon found it hard to believe that, even when he wanted to.
Are you sure you don't need a sip of ambrosia?
Cass drew his focus to her, and he frowned as she waggled the bottle she now held in her hand. He sighed, muttered, "Not gonna happen," and stepped. Chapter 5. Cass set down the bottle of ambrosia she had taken great pains to get her hands on, one that had cost her a small fortune. It had seemed like a good plan at the time, but Daimon was determined to resist her. She had to admit it was getting annoying now. The more he fought her, the more she wanted to tear down that wall he had built around him, and the more it became about something other than using him as a nice diversion. Or, at least, she was beginning to realize this infatuation of hers was becoming dangerous. It had all the hallmarks of something else, something she couldn't afford to indulge in. Merrick took hold of Katerina and Miranda, and Cass didn't wait for him to teleport with them. She summoned a spell that was draining to say the least, and cast it, disappearing in a wink of crimson light. Cool air buffeted her as she appeared on the rooftop of a skyscraper in the middle of the Ginza district of Tokyo, carrying the scent of the city and Daimon. Snow and spice. He smelled of it, roused memories of the desolate lands that had been her home for the first 60 years of her life, before she had found the courage to strike out on her own and leave the coven to live in warmer climes. Only rather than chilling her as those memories did, Daimon's scent stirred heat in her veins. "Since when can you teleport?" Daimon glowered at her from his position near Karis, his arms folded over his chest as he leaned against a block-shaped construction that had vents on all sides of it.
Since always.
She looked at the blue sky and pursed her lips.
Well, since I learned the spell. I don't remember how long ago that was, but I don't think you were asking for specifics.
Merrick appeared with Katerina and Miranda, and Ares quickly followed them, curls of black drifting from the shoulders of his black T-shirt as he stepped forwards towards Karis. "How come you complained so much about being left behind the other day, then?" Daimon's white eyebrows lowered over icy eyes, narrowing them. "Why not just use the spell then?" Partly because she had wanted to be picked for the team. Partly because when she hadn't been picked, she had decided to sulk about it and take it out on him when he returned.
Perhaps I was waiting for you to see my value and do the gentlemanly thing of teleporting me with you.
It seemed like a safe answer, one that would get a reaction from him. He huffed. Before he could speak, Ares said, "Are you two a thing?" "No," Daimon snapped and pushed away from the wall. He cast her a black look and stomped away from her towards the other end of the roof. "Never."
"Never is a long time,"
she murmured, hearing another's voice in her mind as she uttered those words.
"Just like forever."
Daimon looked over his shoulder at her, frowned, and then carried on walking. Eric had said them to her, before Miranda had been born, when Cass had told him it was foolish to fall in love with someone who would only end up dying. He had turned to her and asked her if she had ever been in love. She had responded with never. He had told her that never was a long time, and things would change, and one day she would fall in love and realize what he had, that true love was forever. Cass had countered that forever was a long time, too, a long time to be stuck with the same person. Eric had shaken his head, his look one of despair, and had given up trying to convince her that love was worth the risk and that forever was better than never. Cass smiled as she looked at Mari, crossed the expanse of roof between them, and looped her arm around hers.
"That one is a mite prickly with me."
She glanced at Daimon's back. His shoulders stiffened.
"Because you prod and poke him,"
Mari said, her French accent adding a lightness to her words that wasn't really there. Eric might not have been Miranda's biological father, but the two had ended up with similar personalities. Mari was one of those sweet, forever kind of hearts, too. Cass preferred things to be more for now than forever. Karis, Merrick, Ares, and Daimon stopped in a line, and Karis looked back at her and Mari. "The gate is over there. We can't get any closer without influencing it. The rest is down to you." Karis's cold green eyes settled on Mari. She nodded and drew down a deep breath that had Cass squeezing her arm, unable to hold back the need to reassure her. Cass led her past the brothers, deciding to pick the route furthest from Daimon just to irritate him. She hadn't missed how he had looked when she had spoken of drinking ambrosia with Karis. She sidled close to the black-haired man who was a clone of his father, held a fathomless darkness in him that always warned her away from him. And as predicted, Daimon's gaze instantly seared her. He didn't like her near his only single brother. She noted that and continued walking, the power that emanated from the hidden gate luring her towards it. When it buffeted her as strongly as the autumnal breeze did, she halted and looked at Mari.
You're up?
She released Mari's arm and took 2 steps back, but refused to go any further just in case Mari needed her. The wind caught ribbons of Mari's golden hair as she stood in the middle of the rooftop, her back to Cass. Tokyo stretched around her, a million buildings crammed together into one sprawling claustrophobic space bathed in fading evening light. She swore she could see all of the city from up this high, and it stretched for miles, endless in all directions, a sea of rooftops with sparse patches of green. She missed home, not the coven in Siberia, but her home in the Aegean. It was quiet there, filled with long sunny days and few people to bother her. Plus, everyone there adored and respected her. Mari moved, pulling Cass back to the present as she raised her hands before her, and her head lowered slightly. Cass waited, staring at the point where the power of the gate felt strongest and on high alert, just in case something bad happened. She lined up a series of spells. It always paid to be prepared. Violet light flickered just beyond Mari, and Mari stretched her arms out towards it, her entire body tensing and then beginning to shake as she grunted. The pinprick of light glittered as it hovered a few feet above the flat roof of the towering building, but didn't expand into the central disk of the gate. Mari's shoulders shook as she strained. Cass focused on her and swore under her breath. This was taking too much out of her. She broke towards her, ignoring the muttered comments coming from their audience, and took hold of her.
That's enough.
Cass gripped her arm and lowered it for her, wrapped her other one around Mari's waist as she sagged, breathing hard. She looked back at Karis.
Satisfied?
He nodded. Hopefully the enemy has also lost their ability to command the gate. Do you feel you would be able to open it if there were 2 of you? Mari wearily lifted her head.
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Cass's gaze drifted to Daimon. His ice-blue eyes slowly widened, his eyebrows rising as his lips parted. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking beyond her. Cass whipped around to face that direction. Violet-black clouds billowed outwards from a point near the edge of the rooftop, sparking with green and purple lightning that chased between them as they expanded to fill an area 5 feet wide by 7 feet tall. A portal. She grabbed Mari's wrist and shoved her behind her, pushing her as she quickly backed away from the opening portal, heading towards the brothers and Katerina. Daimon appeared in front of her, together with Ares. It can't be the Wraith. Frost glittered on Daimon's gloves as he curled his hands into fists. Gates are shut to traffic. Ares didn't take his eyes off the portal. No way for Eli to get out of the underworld. It's them.
That's worrying,
Mari said from behind Cass, and Cass couldn't agree more.
I lost my ability to cast a portal and they still have it.
Meaning there was a chance they could still open the gate? Cass glanced at it, a brief look to check that it wasn't forming. The flicker of violet light had disappeared, leaving no trace of the gate behind other than the power she could feel humming in the air and in her bones. In the split second she took her eyes off the ball, demons poured from the portal. Ares and Daimon leaped into action, launching into the midst of them. Several of the human-looking males hissed and grunted as the waning light of day hit them, causing wisps of smoke to rise off their clothes. The rumors about demons were true then. Most of them couldn't handle sunlight without getting burned. They backed off towards the portal, their gazes seeking shadows. The rest surged forwards to meet the brothers. Merrick swept past her, rushing to join his brothers as they fought to hold back the demons, stopping them from nearing the gate. Katerina followed hot on his heels. Cass watched as the hybrid cast a barrier in front of the brothers and the stronger demons slammed into it. Blue hexagonal glyphs appeared in a wave and disappeared. A curious power, effective too. But it cost Katerina. She wobbled on her feet, and Merrick turned back to her, grabbed her wrist, and spun her so her back was to his. Together, they fought a wave of demons as they piled around the edges of the barrier, breaking left and right. To the right, they ran right into Daimon and Ares, who were combining ice and fire with devastating effect, ravaging the enemy forces. Cass cursed when something caught her eye and looked to her right, to the other side of the roof, beyond where the gate was located. Violet-black smoke boiled there, writhing and spreading. Another portal. She wasn't surprised when the two other Erinyes stepped out of it, looking like twins, a perfect reflection of Mirinda with their blue-green eyes and blonde hair twisted into a Greek plait across the tops of their heads. These two wore form-fitting black clothes, though, leather pants and tanks that showed off their figure. Cass had always tried to get Mari to dress a little more like her, a little more provocatively to make the most of her figure. Cal would have a heart attack if he saw Mari dressed like her half-sisters. Shadows rushed across the rooftop, snapping at the black tar and each other, sapping the warmth from the air as they passed Cass. She shivered and watched, fascinated as they rose up from the ground and launched at the Erinyes in a malevolent wave. The two furies broke apart, leaping over the sharp spikes of the shadows and rolling under others, evading them all. The points of the shadows slammed into the rooftop, piercing it before they dissipated. Another wave of shadows rocketed towards the two. Cass lent them a hand, launching several spells, twisting spears of red and gold that shot through the air, aimed at points where she hoped the Erinyes would be foolish enough to leap into their paths. One of the Erinyes managed to evade them all, but the other wasn't as fortunate. She cried out as a spear sliced through her left calf and hit the roof. "Sister!" The second Erinyes shrieked and launched towards her faster than Cass or Karis's shadows could track. She pulled her fallen sibling up just as a shadow reached them, and the injured one gasped as it stabbed into the roof where she had just been. The two Erinyes turned as one towards the gate. That violet light flickered brightly again. Everything and everyone went still, all eyes shooting to the gate. Time seemed to slow as Cass summoned more spells to her fingertips, her breath hitching as she waited for the gate to expand. Only it didn't. A thick earth wall shot up before her, a dome that swept over the point where the gate was located, obscuring her view of the Erinyes. The rich brown mud baked in an instant, small cracks forming across it. "Tell me you just saw that too," Ares grunted as he backhanded a demon and sent him flying across the roof into two more, knocking them over the edge. They screamed as they fell to the road far below, and then silence. "I saw it," Daimon offered.
How can they cast a portal so well, but their ability to command the gate has weakened just as mine has?
Mari kept her eyes on the dome covering the gate, her fingernails turning into short claws as she spread her feet shoulder-width apart. A warrior's stance. It was still unsettling seeing her sweet, kind-hearted Mari transforming into a vicious, battle-hungry fury. Violet shone in Mari's eyes, edged with black. Katerina muttered something in Catalan and turned with Merrick, her back still plastered to his. He finished off the demon she had been fighting, snapping the man's neck with nothing more than a well-aimed uppercut with the heel of his right hand. "Blood!" Katerina hollered as she lashed out at another demon, driving the female back with her sword.
Eli gave me a cocktail of blood. It gave me powers.
She grabbed the demon by her hair and shoved the female's head down fast as she brought her knee up hard. It cracked against the demon's forehead and Katerina released her, letting her crumple to the ground.
What if they have more of that blood?
Katerina looked at Karis, Ares, and then Mari. "I don't like the sound of that." Merrick turned with her again and she shoved her right hand forwards, driving the sword through the eye of a male demon. Ares bit out a black curse. "So now the enemy can siphon powers from blood?" Daimon raised his hand and 5 shards of ice shot up from the rooftop, impaled the demons he had aimed them at and lifted them into the air. The wretched humanoid things struggled, desperately clawing at the ice protruding from them, causing black blood to roll down the slick surface to the roof. "We will find out later." Kara sent a wave of shadows racing over the dome, and Cass's gaze followed them, because she wasn't sure what he was aiming at. The Erinyes. The 2 blondes were coming over the top of the dome, the one on the left falling behind as she limped.
Complete the mission. Grab her,
she bit out from between clenched teeth. The fury on the right nodded. They were talking about Mari. Cass grabbed hold of her and pulled her back when she went to launch forwards, held on to her and refused to let go, weathering a hiss as Mari turned on her violet eyes flashing dangerously. Daemon surged towards them from her left, driving Ares and Daimon back towards her, and more poured through the portal into the falling night. Two demons made it past Ares, snarling and snapping sharp teeth as they lunged in her direction. Daimon appeared between her and the vicious creatures, threw his left hand forwards and sent two spiraling daggers of ice at them. The one on the left went down shrieking. The one on the right nimbly dodged the attack. "Stay close," Daimon growled.
I have this.
Cass countered and unleashed her own attack, a spell designed to freeze blood.
I don't need protecting.
The twin bolts of blue shot past Daimon as he turned icy eyes on her. "I'll decide that." He swept his right arm up, and before her spell could connect and prove that she didn't need him watching out for her, 3 spires of ice shot up from the rooftop, impaling the demon in his thigh, stomach, and shoulder. Cass glared at Daimon as black blood oozed down the jagged, clear ice.
I had that.
She pulled Mari closer to her.
Snegovic.
He scowled at her but said nothing, because he was a snowman, cold as ice, standing alone in this world, bringer of brief joy followed by despair and misery. Perhaps that was a little too harsh, but he had ruined her fun. She had been about to prove she could handle herself, maybe even make him see that she could fight on the front lines if she chose to, and he had spoiled it. Karis hurled another wave of shadows at the Erinyes, and a portal formed behind them. The one on the right backed towards her sister, took hold of her arm and helped her into the portal. She stopped and glared down at Karis, her violet eyes glowing in the fading light, and then stepped into the portal. The shadows tore through it, twisted around, and attacked it again, decimating it. Karis turned to her. "Get Mirinda away from here." She nodded and summoned a spell, but it was chilling darkness that took her and Mirinda from the rooftop, cold that seeped into her from a spot on her wrist, spreading outwards along her arm. Her feet touched solid ground again, and the cold released her, warmth seeping back in to chase it away. She looked at Daimon where he stood beside her, his glacial eyes on her arm. "You all right?" he grumbled, his gaze not leaving the point where he had touched her. She released Mari and rubbed at it, deeply aware of his eyes on it and what he was thinking. Feeling. He was worried he had hurt her. He didn't need to worry. She was tougher than she looked, far tougher than he believed. She skimmed her hand down her arm, revealing where he had touched, and his eyes widened slightly. Leaped to meet hers. Cass lowered hers. To her perfect, unmarked skin. Chapter 6. Daimon backed away from Cassandra, needing some distance between them. It was a trick. It had to be. She had used magic to heal her injuries when she had held her arm, undoing the damage he had done by foolishly grabbing her and teleporting with her. It had been reckless of him, but in the heat of the moment, he hadn't been able to stop himself. The need to get her away from the enemy had been too great. When they had all rushed towards her, something dark inside him had howled for freedom, for him to unleash it on the demons, to protect her. Karis and Ares appeared, shortly followed by Merrick and Katerina. Karis gave him a look, one that had Daimon averting his gaze, hoping that his older brother wouldn't mention what he had done. Whatever wound he had dealt Cass by touching her, she had healed it. No harm, no foul, right? So why did he feel terrible? Cass busied herself with checking Mirinda over from head to toe. Daimon stared at her arm, at the smooth, unblemished skin. He stared at it so hard he began to get the feeling he was willing a mark to show, some evidence that he had hurt her as he suspected and that she had covered it up. Why? His foolish heart answered that. Because she didn't want him to hurt, to feel bad because he had injured her. Her earlier words came back to haunt him, the ones she had murmured when he had told her that she couldn't worship what she couldn't touch.
That's what you think.
Was he wrong about her? Could he touch her without harming her? He had teleported her to the pond and dropped her in it, had stepped with her in Paris, too, when they had been tossed over the side of a steep hill. She hadn't shown any pain. Anger, yes, but not pain. He shook those thoughts away before they could take hold and spread roots. He couldn't touch her. He couldn't touch anyone. Even Megan hurt if their skin was in contact for more than a minute. And even though he didn't give her frostbite, he still chilled her flesh as badly as a frigid, snowy winter's day might. He distanced himself from Cass while she was distracted, heading for the TV area on the right side of the long, open-plan room, and leaving her near the dining table at the other end of it. "We need to test to see if it's possible for a Fury to siphon powers from blood." Karras neatened the cuffs of his black dress shirt, his eyes on Miranda. She looked up at him, her eyes blue-green again now, and nodded. "We have to what now?" Cal came from the corridor beyond the wall that separated the TV area from the north wing of the house. "We suspect the Erinyes can gain abilities by having contact with blood." Merrick finished giving Katerina a thorough once-over. "Katerina suggested it as a possibility when the Erinyes appeared through a portal, using a power that has faded in Miranda." "Your girl-fiend makes a good point. I mean, blood is power, right?" Valen looked over the back of the couch, his golden eyes fixing on Merrick and an expectant look on his face. Merrick's jaw flexed. He gritted. "I told you about calling her my girl-fiend." Katerina petted Merrick's arm and pressed close to him, her black t-shirt blending with his linen shirt.
I don't mind it. I actually sort of like it.
Merrick looked as unimpressed with her as he was with Valen. It was still strange having a human-demon hybrid among their ranks. According to Merrick, Katerina was still developing powers courtesy of the blood Eli had injected her with, a cocktail donated by several members of the enemy ranks. So far, she could teleport, cast barriers, and was faster and stronger than before. She could also see emotional auras, and could release a pheromone that messed with every male in the vicinity. Thankfully, she was learning to control that one, had been focusing on taming it because sometimes it slipped the leash. The first time it had happened, and Daimon and his brothers had been hit with an uncontrollable hunger for pleasure, Karras had banished Katerina from the meeting and the mansion. Merrick had come up with a plan: satisfy that succubus side of Katerina before any meeting. Since then, there had only been a few mishaps. Daimon still hated it whenever it happened. He kept a wary eye on the hybrid as Karras filled the others in on what had happened at the gate. The last thing he needed was Katerina feeling frisky when Cass was around. He would be fine, wouldn't act on anything he felt, and would resist the urges it stirred. Cass wouldn't. He could easily see the witch using it as an excuse to throw herself at him again, attempting to break him. "Cal, it's probably safest if we use some of your blood." Karras looked their youngest brother over. "If you are up to it." Cal swept rogue strands of his blonde hair back into his ponytail and nodded stiffly. "Sure." He didn't look sure. "It shouldn't take much, just a drop or two." Ares gave Cal a concerned look. Karras might be the oldest, but Ares was the real big brother of the group, the one who showed how much he was worried about his siblings rather than hiding it all behind a calm facade and empty eyes. Sometimes Karras was too much like their father. Cal nodded again. Karras went to the kitchen and returned with a shallow bowl and the biggest knife Daimon had ever seen. "You expecting him to chop his hand off?" Daimon jerked his chin towards the blade. "Little excessive." Karras arched an eyebrow at the knife. "A blade is a blade." And yet Karras had picked the biggest of the bunch. Cal swallowed hard at the sight of it, but still crossed the tatami mats to their oldest brother and held his wrist out. "Not inside," Daimon snapped. Karras stilled with the knife poised close to Cal's wrist. Escher would flip. He strode over to Karras, took the blade from him, and walked into the kitchen. "He'd flip if he knew you'd used his sushi knife for slicing a vein open, too." He sat the prized knife back in position on the counter, smoothed his fingers over the handle, and lingered. Escher had waxed lyrical about the knife for close to 3 months after he had bought it, braving entering a store filled with mortals to pick one out. It had been a win for his brother, and a serious test of his strength and courage. Escher despised mortals, had done since they had captured and tortured him centuries ago, driving him close to death several times before he had managed to escape. Daimon picked a smaller paring knife from the block on the counter, walked back into the living room and straight through it to the front door. He stepped out onto the porch and didn't stop until he was in the middle of the front garden, standing on the largest of the stepping stones. At least if Cal bled here, he could wash it away and Escher might not notice. Karras and Cal appeared in the doorway, took the step down to the broad flat stones set among pale gravel, and crossed the short distance to him. Miranda followed, tucked close to Cass, who rubbed her arms as she guided her towards them.
Just relax, sweetie. It's only blood,
Cass murmured, and Miranda nodded and blew out her breath. Had it been anyone but Cal's blood, Miranda probably wouldn't have minded as much. Daimon could see it as she looked at Cal, concern shining in her eyes. Cal held his wrist out the moment he reached Daimon. Get it over with. Instead of slicing his vein open as he clearly expected, Daimon ran the knife over his palm, making the cut just deep enough to draw a sufficient amount of blood. Cal looked down at the thin dark line on his palm and shrugged. That works too. Karis offered the shallow white bowl, and Cal held his hand over it, turned it sideways, and curled his fingers into a fist. He squeezed, and droplets of blood formed on the edge of his hand, trembled, and fell into the bowl, stark against the white. When a small pool had formed in the bottom of it, covering it in a layer, Cal withdrew his hand, and Karis pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to him. Cal wrapped the black material around his hand and then took the bowl from him and turned to Miranda. Miranda swallowed hard, pulled down another breath, blew it out. She hesitated, and Cass rubbed her shoulders as she murmured gentle words of encouragement. Miranda raised her hand and edged her fingers towards the bowl, and hesitated again. She clenched her hands into fists, closed her eyes, and then opened her hand and quickly dipped her fingers into the blood. Her mouth twisted.
That should do it.
Cass gently took hold of Miranda's wrist and drew her hand away from the bowl, produced a cloth out of thin air, and used it to wipe Miranda's fingers clean.
Now, do you feel anything?
Miranda opened her eyes and shook her head.
Try anyway.
Cass offered an encouraging smile. It was strange seeing this side of her, the warm, caring side that she worked so hard to hide from him and his brothers. Normally, he only caught glimpses of it when she thought no one was looking and she was alone with Miranda. Miranda closed her eyes again, breathed in slowly, and tipped her head up, going still. Cal inched back a step. Karis remained where he was. Daimon stood his ground, too. At worst, Miranda would send him flying. A thought hit him. Or she could accidentally suffocate him. He was about to ease back a step, too, when Cass's gaze landed on him. He planted his boots to the floor, refusing to let her see that he was afraid of Miranda and what she might do, which was apparently nothing. Miranda opened her eyes and muttered a curse in French.
I don't feel anything. I can't do anything.
When she huffed and threw her hands up in the air, her frustration getting the better of her, Cal's lime green and black motorbike slammed into the other one and knocked it over, and one of the stone lanterns wobbled and then settled again. The hell? Cal muttered and stepped, appearing near his fallen bikes. He grabbed the racing bike and had it back upright just as Miranda reached him, speaking to him in rapid French, apologizing over and over again. He huffed, sighed, and gathered her into his arms. It's okay. Daimon exchanged a worried look with his brothers. They were going to have to be more careful now. If the enemy got hold of their blood, they could use it to open the gates. Everyone on the porch turned away and headed back inside, and Karis followed, leaving Daimon alone with Cass, Cal, and Miranda. Cal looked Miranda over and slung his arm around her shoulder. Let's get you cleaned up. Cass trailed after them as they headed inside, paused on the porch, and looked back at him. Daimon turned away from her, heading towards the bikes and past them, following the path of stepping stones around the north wing of the house. He needed a moment to process everything, and not just the fact the Erinyes, and therefore the enemy, could use blood to gain powers. He needed to process how he had reacted at the gate when Cass had come under attack. Anger simmered in his blood, burned in his heart. Not aimed at her. He aimed it at himself. He tried to reason that he had only reacted like that, leaping in to protect her, because she was part of their team and they couldn't afford to lose another one of them. They needed all the warriors they could get, and he was man enough to admit Cass was useful in battle, was powerful and capable, kept her head no matter how bad the situation got, and did all she could to help and ensure they won. But it wasn't the truth. There was something about her, something that tied him in knots and had him hating himself. He shouldn't be thinking about her. He slipped his hand into the pocket of his black jeans and touched the pendant on his phone, tempted to focus so he could see Penelope, needing to see her. He had to do something, because the iron will he had forged over the centuries was beginning to buckle. He shouldn't be thinking about another woman, shouldn't be wanting another woman. He was loyal to Penelope, and that loyalty had stayed strong in the past when other females had approached him. So why was it failing him now? His heart answered that question. Things were different with Cass. She tempted him like no other had before her. He reached the rear garden and skirted the edge of the koi pond, his gaze drifting to the end of the north wing, where the covered walkway extended over the water. He could almost see Escher sitting there with his legs dangling over the edge, his feet almost touching the water, all the colorful carp gathering beneath him as he fed them. Gods, he missed his brother. Needed him now more than ever. He needed to speak with someone, just as he always had whenever he had a problem. But Escher wasn't here, and he didn't know where he was. His blood slowly chilled, his steps faltering as he stared at that spot Escher had loved so much, unable to hold back the fear that rose to grip him, to sink icy claws into him and tear open his heart. Was Escher in danger? Was he fighting for his life even now, while Daimon stood in the garden doing nothing, waiting for him to come back? He shuddered as a chill swept through him and huddled down into his roll-neck top. What was he doing? Escher needed him, and he should be looking for him, doing something to bring him back. He should be in the underworld, leading his father's legions in their search. He should be there for Escher, doing all in his power to keep him safe from harm. He clenched his fists at his sides and frowned at the walkway. He was letting his brother down, leaving him to fend for himself, leaving him alone, just as Escher had left him alone.
Daimon?
Anger swelled like a fierce tide within him as that female voice pierced his thoughts, shattering his solitude, never giving him a moment's peace. He narrowed his eyes on Cass's feet where she stood on Escher's spot, and rage curled through him, had ice forming over his hands as he lifted his gaze to her face and glared at her. Pain pulsed through him with every beat of his heart, a constant agony that was slowly ripping him apart, fueling the frustration that mounted inside him each day Escher was missing, frustration he couldn't hold back as he stared at Cassandra. "How many times do I have to tell you to leave me alone?" He stepped up onto the decking and strode towards her, the part of him that said to rein in his temper easily crushed under the weight of his pain and fear. "You dare come here, standing on this spot, his spot." He was being unreasonable. He knew that as he advanced on her, and rather than standing her ground, she backed away.
"I didn't know," she bit out, defensive. "I was only worried about you."
"Well, stop," he barked. "Stop worrying about me. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of everything. I'm sick of this place. I'm sick of—" He reared away and turned his back on her, breathed hard and tried to rein in his emotions, before he did something he would regret, or at least something worse.
"Very well,"
Cass muttered, none of her usual strength or bite in those two words. She stormed away from him, the distance between them yawning like a chasm that flooded him with cold, because it dawned on him that she had finished his sentence for him, and that was the reason she was getting away from him as quickly as she could manage without using magic. She thought he had been on the verge of saying that he was sick of her. He hadn't been. He had stopped himself from confessing something that would have given her a glimpse of what was in the heart he protected behind a wall of ice. He was sick of being alone. He walked to the corner of the wooden deck and looked left, towards the main room of the house. As his anger and frustration faded, the fear lingered, had his gaze seeking her as regret flared inside him. He scrubbed his right hand over his white hair and sighed when he couldn't spot her. He focused his senses, and regret turned to relief when he located her on the other side of the topiary garden that filled the space between the three sides of the mansion. He really needed to learn to keep his temper in check around her. The last thing he wanted was to drive her away. She was liable to do something foolish, like thinking she didn't need him or his brothers and striking out on her own. She would be vulnerable alone. The thought of her coming under attack, targeted by the enemy, had his gut churning with acid, scouring his insides and filling him with a need to find her. Rather than surrendering to that need, he kept his senses locked on her, satisfying his need to know she was safe. He looked to his right at the garden and then heaved another sigh. He needed to cool off. He looked down at himself. And wash off. Black blood streaked his clothes, thick lines of it that were glossy against his jeans and navy long sleeve. It had dried on his gloves, too. Rather than seeking solitude in the garden, he followed the raised walkway back to the main room of the house and banked right, heading for the panels that had been pushed aside to join the house to the garden, and almost ran straight into Cal. His younger brother stopped dead, narrowly avoiding the collision. "You good?" Daimon nodded. "Yeah, you?" He looked down at Cal's hand and stilled as his gaze caught on the blue script that tracked along the inside of his brother's right forearm. His favor mark. Before he could stop himself, he said, "It can take me to the underworld, right?" His heart missed a beat and thudded hard against his chest, his breath stuttering from his lips as he waited, the need to find Escher blazing back to life inside him, stronger than it had been in the garden before Cass had come to him. Cal placed a hand over the ink. "It can, but I don't really have the strength to use it right now. And if I did, I'd be the one going." Daimon lifted his gaze to lock with Cal's. For once, his brother looked serious. Cal's fingers tightened over his arm, pressing into his flesh. "It's my fault he went. I should have stopped him." "I can bring him back, Cal." Daimon reached for his brother's hand, filled with a need to rip it from his arm and read the words written on his skin, a gift from Hermes. He stopped just short of touching his brother, laboring for breath as he saw how close he had come to grabbing him. He flexed his fingers and eased them back, swallowed, and looked into Cal's eyes. "I need to bring him back." "I know." Aries' deep voice rolled over him like a soothing wave, chasing the cold from his veins. Daimon looked across at him, his brow furrowing. "I know," Aries repeated and raised his hand, ghosted it over Daimon's shoulder, the closest they could come to touching each other without risking injury. "But you know he wouldn't want you there." He did, and it was hard to swallow that bitter pill. Escher had turned on him when he had tried to stop him from entering the gate, his other side firmly in control. That side of Escher would fight him if he tried to reach him, would believe he was trying to interfere with his hunt and would lash out. His brother would hate himself if he hurt anyone in his family, especially Daimon. He knew that, but it didn't make it any easier on him. He needed to find his brother and bring him back, to the only home they had right now. Ares sighed, his broad shoulders lifting with it. "Father has legions scouring the underworld for the Wraith, thankfully to assist Escher rather than capture him and bring him in for breaking into the underworld again. All we can do is wait for someone to find Eli, and therefore Escher and for Dad to send word, or for Escher to capture his prey and come home." Daimon forced himself to nod. It wasn't enough for him, and it pained him to pretend that it was. He kept his eyes off the mark on Cal's arm, deeply aware of it and the power it held, that it could take him to the underworld, to his real home, the place where he belonged, where his power would no longer be a problem. "You need to take 5? Ares canted his head, concern warming his dark eyes as he stared into Daimon's. Daimon blew out his breath and nodded, grateful for the fact his brother could see that he was struggling, that this was all becoming too much for him, and he needed to get away for a while. He wanted to be here for Escher, keeping Iko company and keeping the place in order, waiting for him to return. But being here was a constant reminder that Escher was missing, and he couldn't do anything about it. "No more than an hour or two, okay?" Ares' eyes gained a hard edge that quickly faded back to concern. "You'll be careful?" Daimon nodded again. "Anything feels off, I'll step back here." Ares still looked reluctant to let him go. So Daimon stepped without saying another word, landing on the broad white terrace of his home on the steep side of Victoria Peak, Hong Kong spread in all its towering neon glory below him. Rather than feeling relieved to get away from the mansion and finally have the space he needed, all he felt was concern, worry about a witch. He tipped his head back and closed his eyes, a single thought flowing through him. No good could come from that. Chapter 7. Cass remained with her back to the wall at the end of the corridor near the kitchen, lingering long after Daimon had stepped, his power disappearing from the tangle that filled the air. She inwardly cursed. She should have known better than to approach Daimon when he had been seeking solitude, but some ridiculous part of her had needed to be near him, had needed him to know he wasn't alone, even when he felt he was. The same ridiculous part that had hoped he would show her that the same was true for her. She wasn't afraid, not of anything. She wasn't. She didn't feel this pressing need to be close to him because she wanted him to protect her, to save her from the fate that loomed on the horizon ahead of her, casting her future in a black shadow. She could protect herself. She always had. She didn't need anyone. She didn't. Yet she couldn't stop herself from hurrying through the main room of the mansion to Callistos' room, poking her head inside, looking at Mari and saying,
"I'm going to rest for a while, if you don't mind."
Mari shook her head.
"No, of course. I'm a little tired myself."
Mari was absolutely that, if tired was a synonym for horny. Her friend was restless, fidgeting with folding clothes and idly cleaning the sparsely furnished room. When Cass lingered, Mari gave her a look that screamed that she wanted her to go away so Cal would come to her. Cass had far too much dignity to be a cock-blocker. It was beneath her. Mari was her ward, but she was a grown woman, and Cass accepted that grown women had needs, especially when a handsome god was in the vicinity. Where had her handsome god gone? She dipped her head to Mari, turned and rounded the corner, and strode past Callistos, murmuring,
"Don't do anything I wouldn't do."
For some reason, he shuddered. She supposed she had been on his case since meeting him. He wasn't used to this side of her, the one that didn't want to string his entrails around the mansion like bunting. The moment she reached her temporary quarters in Karis's room, she slid the panel that acted as a door closed and focused, checking her surroundings. All the brothers were far away enough. She muttered an incantation, one that would give the illusion she was in the room, and then followed it with another spell, one that transported her to Hong Kong. The moment she touched down on the winding road that cut up the side of the steep hill of Victoria Peak, she paused. What was she doing? Hadn't she already disturbed Daimon's solitude? She stood there on the narrow road, the only sound the trees rustling in the gentle breeze and her heart beating in her ears. Why couldn't she leave him alone? She stared straight ahead of her, up the slope that would lead to his impressive modern home perched on the side of the hill, one she had visited more than once during her study of him before she had met Callistos, before she had really met Daimon. Back then, everything had been so uncomplicated. He had been nothing but a target, someone to study and catalog so she could be sure he was worthy of being one of Mari's protectors as Eric had wanted. Now she wasn't sure what he was to her, but she knew what he couldn't be. Now everything was too complicated. She told herself to leave, to give him the peace he needed, but her feet carried her forwards against her will. She needed to see him. Just needed to see he was all right, and then she would go. She would keep her distance so he wouldn't sense her, would watch over him to make sure nothing happened while he was lost in his thoughts. Ares wasn't the only one who had noticed that the disappearance of Escher weighed heavily on Daimon, and despite his best efforts to do what he felt was right, taking care of the family home that Escher cherished and Aiko, sometimes it became too much for him. During her study of the brothers, she had watched Daimon taking care of Escher, always there for the beast, always watching over him, always ready to bring him back from the edge. She had mused that the fates had gotten their entrance into this world the wrong way around, and that Daimon should have been the older brother. Now she could see how wrong she had been. Daimon needed his older brother as deeply as Escher needed him, possibly even more so. He was falling apart without him, gradually succumbing to whatever dark things plagued him and stole pieces of his strength each day, each hour that Escher was missing. She reached a fork in the road and stopped, her eyes fixed on the illuminated white concrete, glass, and steel building at the end of the route in front of her. The city lights reflected off the thick glass that acted as a railing around the terrace, and shone on the man standing at those railings, his profile to her, wind tousling his white hair. She slowly lifted her hand and lightly pressed her fist to her chest, fighting the need to go to him, to show him that he wasn't alone, and lift that somber look from his face, shattering the hopelessness that she could see in his eyes. He would hate her for it. He was hurting, and he would lash out at her, and then he would hate himself. She had been caught up in that cycle with him several times since Escher had disappeared, seemed as bound by some cruel master of their fates as he was, feeling as if someone behind the scenes was pulling strings to make her do these reckless and foolish things. Things she knew would only end in the same way, with him lashing out, with her hating herself, with him hating himself. And then a brief truce, a point where they were calm around each other, able to enjoy the other's company without inflicting pain. Daimon stepped. As she stared at the black vapor trail of his teleport, her heart whispered at her to follow. She knew where he was going. She summoned the spell, even though it taxed her to do it, had her legs wobbly beneath her when she landed near the water. She stared across the narrow stretch of it to the Star Ferry dock, watched him boarding one as he often did, making the journey from the island to the Kowloon district. She couldn't understand why he did this ritual. He avoided contact with others, especially with humans, yet he always chose to cross the water in this manner, on a rickety green and white double-decker boat that was always packed with humans. And he always took the same route when he reached the other side, walking the Avenue of the Stars for a short distance before he stopped to stare back across the water at the Hong Kong Island skyline, taking it in. Or did he see something else? She had done her research and knew that if the brothers focused, they could see the future of this world in all its morbid, fiery horror, and sometimes even when they weren't trying. She muttered the spell again, risking it, and transported herself to the other side of the water, landing near a group of tourists. They would provide her cover. As predicted, Daimon walked to the same spot he always did and stopped, gazing across the water that rippled with color from the neon on the buildings on the opposite bank. His handsome face hardened. She suspected he wasn't viewing the here and now, but rather what was to come. She fell into studying him as she always did whenever he wasn't aware of her, whenever he came to this spot, trying to piece together a clearer picture of him. He idly touched the roll neck of the top he wore beneath his long black coat, stroking his gloved fingers along it, his eyes still locked on the skyline. His shoulders trembled, a brief shudder she would have missed if she hadn't been watching him so closely. His power was acting up. Did it hurt him when it did that? Did he hate the cold that racked him? Was it the reason he kept his distance from everyone? She couldn't imagine what it was like to live as he did, unable to touch anyone, fearing he might kill them by mistake if he let them get too close to him. Hades was an unsympathetic bastard to force Daimon to remain in this world when he was suffering because of it. Daimon masked it well, but she could see it, especially when his brothers and their women were around. He often singled out Ares, secretly watching him interact with Megan. She wanted to know why he watched Ares more than the others. Because Ares shared his problem? Because Megan was immune to the heat that constantly shimmered over his skin? She wanted to reveal herself and ask Daimon about it, but more than that, she wanted to watch him, drinking in this side of him, this quiet thoughtfulness, and how handsome he was when he wasn't snapping at her. If she revealed herself to him, he would push her away. He frowned and lowered his head, pulled a phone from his jeans pocket and stared at it, the screen illuminating his face. He pocketed it again and turned away from the view, his long legs swiftly carrying him back the way he had come. Where was he going in such a hurry? She trailed after him, curiosity gripping her. That curiosity only increased when he stopped where the pedestrian pathway met the road and hailed a cab. She hurried to catch up with him, hailing a taxi for herself when she reached the road and slipping into the back of it. Felt like a cliché as she said, "Follow that cab." It was strangely thrilling as the vehicle pulled away, tailing the one Daimon was in as it moved deeper into the heart of the city, beyond the business districts and high-rises to smaller buildings and a more suburban setting. "Stop!" she hissed as the cab Daimon was in pulled up outside a long stone building that had a colonial air about it. Daimon stepped out of the taxi and jogged up the steps, pushed one of the large double doors open, and disappeared inside. Cass paid her driver and slipped out onto the pavement. She eased towards the three-story building, her heart hammering in her throat and that curiosity tugging her forwards, even as part of her screamed to leave and not snoop into things for once. Her gaze drifted over the building, with its columns and tall sash windows. It looked like a bank or the head office of some grand company in Europe, was out of place among the tattered buildings that surrounded it. Someone had taken great care of this one building while the others of its age had fallen into ruin around it. She came to an abrupt halt as she reached the 5 steps that led up to the door, her gaze snagging on the brass sign mounted on the wall beside it. An orphanage? Why had Daimon come to an orphanage? She was so busy staring at the sign, trying to find an answer to that question, that she missed the door opening. It's no problem. If anything happens again, call me. Little guy needs some extra attention to help him settle in, that's all. Daimon turned away from the middle-aged Chinese woman and froze. What are you doing here? Cass tensed, her eyes leaping to him, instinct pushing that same question to the tip of her tongue. He huffed, and for a moment she thought he would lash out at her, but then he calmly turned to the woman behind him and offered her a warm smile. Anything, really. Just call. She nodded and disappeared inside. Daimon closed the door, the sound of it slamming cranking up the tension Cass felt. She braced herself. Rather than turning on her, he casually walked down the steps and up to her. This goes no further. Got it? He said, and she wanted to argue with him because she hadn't meant to snoop, and she knew he was angry with her, but she didn't want him kicking her out of the Tokyo mansion or banishing her or whatever he had in mind. She would stop irritating him, would pretend she didn't give a damn about him, if he would relent and let her stay. He scrubbed a hand over his hair. None of my brothers know about this place. Her eyes widened. Oh. He meant knowledge of this place went no further than the two of them, not things between them went no further, and she was out on her backside. I've never seen you come here before. Her shoulders went rigid when he frowned at her, and she realized she had just confessed to following him before tonight. I had to study all of you. I had to be sure Mari was in safe hands. Daimon looked back over his shoulder at the building. Is that what you do here? She glanced at the sign and then back at him. You keep children safe. He sighed, raked fingers through his hair again, and looked as if he wouldn't answer those questions. But then he nodded. There's a lot of less fortunate children in this city. Kids who have no parents. Kids who have parents who hurt them. I opened this place for them. Everyone gets an education, food, and the choice of finding new parents. My brothers don't know about it, and I don't want them to know. Do you understand that, Cass? She shivered at the delicious sound of her name on his tongue. She couldn't remember him saying it, and if he had never said it like that. Softly, almost tenderly. She nodded. Why is it a secret, though? Escher. That one-word answer was enough. His brother wouldn't understand why Daimon was taking care of humans. Why did you do this for the children? She couldn't stop that question from leaving her lips as she gazed up at the building and thought about what he was doing, and realized that the reason the building appeared as it might have back when it was built was because Daimon had been the one to pay for it then. He had been running this home for children for 2 centuries. His expression turned guarded. Why, Daimon? She risked a step towards him, her tone softening as she stared deep into his ice-blue eyes, seeking the answer there. Go back to the mansion. He stared down at her, a cold edge entering his eyes. No. She took another step, closing the distance between them down to only a few inches. Daimon made a lunge for her, and she was quick to evade him, aware that if he got his hand on her, he would teleport her back to the mansion, and she wouldn't have the strength to teleport herself after him again when he came back to Hong Kong. Why are you so difficult all the time? Why do you never do as you're told? He barked as he made another attempt to seize hold of her. Cass froze a short distance from him, beyond arm's reach, and stared at him as shock rolled through her, a chilling sort of cold that irritated the hell out of her. As I'm told, she bit out, her eyebrows lowering as her lips flattened, the thought that he believed she should do as he bid raising her hackles. I'm a powerful sorceress, Daimon. I can take care of myself. I don't need a man to take care of me. I'm not some weak, delicate little female you can order around. She hurled the last few words at him, fury getting the better of her, tinged with disappointment. When had she ever given him the impression that she couldn't handle things, that she needed some white knight figure to protect her? His face darkened, his jaw ticking as he glared at her. The pain that surfaced in his eyes was phenomenal, pain that went deep. She had struck a nerve, but she wasn't sure how or why. "Make your own way home, then." He backed off a step, still glowering at her. "It's not my fucking business. And this here," he pointed to the building to his right, "this isn't your business, so stay the hell out of it." He disappeared, leaving a trail of black smoke in his wake that was thicker than normal, swirled eerily in the disturbed air. Cass's shoulders sagged as all her tension rushed out of her. She bit out a curse. How did things between them always end in an argument? She didn't mean for it to happen, and part of her felt it wasn't entirely her fault. Daimon was a minefield, and even the slightest misstep on her part had him exploding at her. She tipped her head back, closed her eyes, and loosed a long sigh. Time for another apology. This time, she would make it good enough to heal whatever wound she had inflicted on him, even though she wasn't sure what she had done to hurt him. She tried to summon the spell to transport herself. Weakness rolled through her before she managed to finish the first part of the incantation. Great. She walked to the main road and hailed a cab. It was going to take longer than she wanted to reach Daimon. A cab, a ferry, another cab. She only hoped he had gone back to his home in the hills, because if he had gone back to Tokyo, she was even more screwed. She chuckled mirthlessly at that. It turned out she needed him after all. She sighed as she sagged into the back of a taxi. In more ways than she wanted to admit. She stared out at the city as the vehicle moved, her mind filled with one thought. If she'd had a different life, another life, would Daimon have been hers? Chapter 8. Daimon cut through the water, focused on his breathing, on each stroke of his arms and pump of his legs, trying to shut everything out and relax, something which seemed impossible these days. He pivoted at the wall, pressed his feet to the white tiles, and kicked off, propelling himself back down the length of his pool. The heated water cooled around him, but not enough that he caused any icebergs to run into as he reached the end of the pool, twisted under the water, and kicked off again. He wasn't sure how many lengths he had done, or how many more he would need before he was too tired to think. He wanted to forget the things Cass had thrown at him, but they echoed in his mind, filling it with thoughts of her. Her words troubled him, and so had the thought that had hit him in that moment. No, she wasn't a weak female he could order around, one who would do as she was told. She wasn't meek, obedient. She wasn't Penelope. He gritted his teeth and slammed his hands against the wall of the pool as he reached it, stopping dead. He shouldn't have thought those things about her. He shouldn't have compared Cass to her. It had been wrong of him. He growled at himself and pushed off, floated backwards and stretched out on the surface, staring at the faint stars. He couldn't take that thought back, though, no matter how much he wanted to. It had been wrong of him, but it was the truth. Penelope had been the sort of woman to do as a man bid, but times had been different. Obedience in a female had been expected back then. He squeezed his eyes shut. That wasn't true either. His mother had never been obedient to his father, not really. Calendria, his sister, had never been obedient to their parents or any of her brothers, not even her twin cow. He hated himself for thinking badly of Penelope, finding fault in her when he should have loved everything about her. But all these centuries on, the fact that she had been that way, had been meek and accepting rather than confident and challenging, still didn't sit well with him. He bumped against the edge of the pool. He lowered his legs and stretched his arms along the curved lip of the wall, stared towards the road beyond the gates of his garden. Was it wrong of him to find faults in Penelope? Was it wrong of him to find the things that she had lacked appealing in Cassandra? Was it wrong of him to find Cassandra appealing at all? Was it wrong of him to want her with a ferocity that shook him at times? He flinched as a sharp pain stabbed his right arm just above his elbow, and looked there, the city beyond the glass barrier a blur as his eyes focused on the mosquito. It was fat, sucking greedily on his blood. He raised his arm before him and frowned at the bug, cursing the fact he had been given such a warm place to protect. The damn things would eat him alive if they had the opportunity. He didn't swat it away. He waited, watched, smiled as it slowly froze and dropped off him. Sometimes being ice-cold was a blessing, not a curse. Daimon tipped his head back and rested it on the smooth edge of the pool as he stretched his right arm out again. Small chunks of ice knocked against him, but they didn't bother him. It was par for the course when he stopped moving, and tonight he wanted the cold. Insect song filled the silence as he stared at the stars glittering above him. Peaceful. What he needed. What he had been trying to find since Cass had come crashing into his life. So why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Why did he feel bad that he had left her in the city, in a part of it that could be rough at times, dangerous? Why did he want to step back to the orphanage and try to find her? She didn't need his protection. She had made that clear several times now, grew angry with him whenever he tried to look out for her. A shiver ran through him. Not cold. Heat. Incredible heat. He slowly opened his eyes and lowered his head. Cass stood at the other end of the long pool, her back to the black iron gate and her eyes on his body. He frowned at her. "How did you get through the wards without me feeling it?" He suddenly braced himself for a fight when she lifted her pale blue eyes from his body, a frown marring her pretty face. He hadn't sensed her breaching the wards, and he should have. He stretched his senses out around him, checking them. They were all still intact. Cass drew down a long breath, raised her right hand so her palm was facing him, and her expression went slack.
I beseech you to listen to me, son of Hades, guardian of the sixth gate, ruler of ice, king of Hong Kong, tamer of—
Daimon raised his hand too. "I know the long and boring version of my name. What I don't know is why you're using it. I'm trying to relax. I told you to go back to Tokyo." Her right eyebrow arched.
And I told you, you have zero authority over me.
"Leave." He didn't want her to do that, was relieved to see she was safe, but he couldn't stop himself from pushing her to see what she would do. She scowled at him, a mulish twist to her soft lips.
I don't want to leave.
"You need to get out," he countered. She responded by stepping forwards, her black dress slinking around her long legs with each step, flashing a lot of creamy skin as the slit up the left side opened. God, she was beautiful. Her fall of onyx hair shimmered in the light from the pool and the house to his left. Her pale blue eyes were bright as she locked them on him, ringed by black makeup that only made the color of them even more striking. And she smelled of sin and magic, that scent teasing his senses as wickedly as her smile did, as she slowly bent and grazed her fingers across the water of the pool, as if testing the temperature. Blocks of ice formed, clunking together and breaking apart, spreading towards him. The water temperature dropped to a dangerous level, where it was liable to freeze completely.
You need to cool down.
She held his gaze, her smile drawing his to her lips, his thoughts to things he shouldn't be contemplating.
And listen.
She drew her hand away from the water, and it began to warm again. Daimon stared at her. She was singing a song to his heart. The icy water was a delight, exactly what he needed tonight. Sheer pleasure rippled through him, and her smile turned more wicked. She gave him a coy look, one that said she knew what she had done, how she had pleased him, and that she took pleasure from it too.
Will you hear me out? Perhaps you would be more inclined to listen if I joined you in there?
She stroked her fingers across her cleavage, and his gaze tracked her black nails. He wanted to touch her like that. She reached beneath her arm, and he shivered as she lowered a zipper, the sound of it sending a hot wave of need bolting through him. His breaths came faster as she eased the front of her dress forwards, flashing the side of her breast. Her bare breast. If she got naked, if she came into the pool, he would want to touch her and he wouldn't be able to stop himself. He shook his head. "You shouldn't get too close to me, Cass." She smiled knowingly and held her dress up with one hand as she stroked the fingertips of the other one across her chest.
You can't freeze this heart. It's been frozen for a century. But I could thaw yours.
She dipped and touched the water again. The ice melted in an instant and steam rose from the water. Daimon stepped, appearing on the broad white tiles of the terrace. He stared at the steaming water and then sneered at her, need tangling with anger, pain with fury. It all collided inside him, tearing at him, filling his head with ridiculous, impossible things. She was tormenting him. "What do you want from me, Kodunya?" He stalked towards her, determined to get an answer, because he was tired of her toying with him when she knew all about him. when she knew he couldn't touch anyone without hurting them. She disappeared when he reached her and reappeared behind him. He turned on a growl and lunged for her, but she was too quick, nothing more than a blur as she sped around behind him again, evading him. She laughed, high and infuriating, pushing him right to the edge. Darkness poured through his veins, roused by the thought she was taunting him, toying with him, out to hurt him for some reason. He let it get the better of him as he tried to grab her again, as she evaded him and moved to the other end of the pool. Her smile ripped a growl from him, and he stepped, appeared, and stepped again when she went to move. He snagged her arm, but she disappeared in blue-black smoke, and he realized it had been a decoy, a false impression of her. His senses sparked. He turned on a pinhead to face her, raising his hand at the same time. Her fingers locked around his wrist, stopping him from grabbing her. Her gaze ran over him, heat rolling in the wake of it as she stared at his bare chest and stomach, and then ventured lower to his black swimming trunks.
Such a chilly reception.
She smiled dazedly, her eyes glittering with sparks of silver and blue.
Here I thought you would have warmed to me by now.
He glared at her and then realized something. His eyes leaped to her hand where it gripped his wrist. It was warm, soft, and his touch wasn't harming her. He couldn't believe it. Cass released his wrist and trailed her fingers along it, sending 1,000 lightning strikes chasing up his arm. She stroked her nails over his hand, and all he could do was watch her, lost in sensation, swept up in the feel of being intimately touched by a female for the first time in centuries.
I only wanted to apologize,
she murmured, that pout back in her voice. He kept staring at her hand, shivering and on the verge of groaning as she teased his palm. What for? He muttered, struggling to convince himself to stop her. This was wrong of him, wasn't it? Was it so wrong that he wanted this? Penelope flashed across his mind. It was. He pulled his hand away from Cass. Her eyes lifted to collide with his.
For everything.
Those words were sincere, as if she actually meant them. He tried to convince himself that she didn't, that this was all some cruel game to her, a way of amusing herself. But he got stuck on the fact that she had touched him without being hurt, that he could touch her. Was this rush of sensation, this overload of need, how Ares had felt when he had met Megan? If it was, then he couldn't blame his brother for succumbing to it. But it wasn't real. Or at least what was happening between him and Cass wasn't real. Wasn't what he needed deep in his heart. She proved that by sidling closer to him, a seductive sway to her hips, and letting her dress droop a little lower, flashing the curves of her breasts at him as she smiled and gazed up into his eyes.
I told you I could worship you if you let me,
she husked, her voice a throaty whisper.
Now all you have to do is let me, Daimon. Just drop that guard and take what you want. Whatever you need, it's yours.
Tempting, but a lie. What he wanted, what he needed, would never be his. She lifted her hand and brought it towards his chest. Daimon seized her wrist and stopped her. Spare yourself the trouble and disappointment, Cassandra, and give up now. Nothing can melt my heart. He tightened his grip on her wrist, driving his point home, and pain flared in her eyes as his power finally managed to make contact with her, breaking past whatever spell she was using to protect herself from him. Nothing. He cast her hand away from him and didn't look at her as he moved past her, heading for his house. His feet dragged, his steps slowing as the distance between them grew, filling him with a need to stop and look back at her, to forget everything and take her up on her offer. No strings attached. That's what she wanted. It had been right there in her eyes. For some reason, that irritated the hell out of him. Why had she targeted him? Because he was single? Because she believed he would be easy to sway because of his problem? It definitely wasn't because she viewed him as anything more than a brief fling, a nice conquest to add to what was probably a long line of them. Was this how she operated? Seeking men out to satisfy her needs. How many had she been with? How many more would she be with once she was done with him? He curled his fingers into fists and clenched them, his arms shaking as the darkness rose within him again, fueled by the thought she wanted to use him, that she was determined to break him. He looked back at her, and not a single ounce of regret or guilt shone in her eyes. Maybe her heart was as cold as his was, and she didn't know how to be warm, only knew how to take what she wanted, regardless of the consequences or devastation she might leave in her wake. Well, he wasn't going to give her what she wanted. He wasn't going to break. He needed to remain faithful to Penelope. But God's Cass made it hard. He stared at her, drawn to her even as he wanted to push her away, aching with a need to feel her skin against his and know her taste. He silently cursed her, hated how easily she stole his focus and how readily his body responded to her, even before he had known he could touch her. Now her presence was a torment. No, it was a test of his strength, and he wouldn't falter. The feelings he had for Cassandra were just lust, fueled by how long he had gone without a woman's touch. It was infatuation, nothing more. In time, it would pass. She would move on and he would return home.
I can see the battle in you, Daimon,
she whispered and canted her head to her left.
Why fight this? Why fight me? This attraction between us isn't going anywhere. Just surrender to it.
He stood his ground. I meant what I said. My heart belongs to another.
I don't want your heart,
she whispered. And it hit him. That was the problem. She didn't really want him. She wanted his body. He was just convenient, attractive. Feelings didn't come into it for her. She just wanted something fast and fun to pass the time. He wanted something else, something more, something he had no right desiring. A cold, hollow feeling opened in his chest. He wanted her. All of her, nothing held back. Not just for now. The darker side of his blood snarled at the thought of giving her up. He shoved his fingers through his wet hair. What was she doing to him? He had been fine before she had come along, his heart constant and his mind clear, his focus on his mission and on returning to the underworld. He closed his eyes, shutting the world out. He hadn't been fine. He could see it now that Cass had opened his eyes. He had been lying to himself for centuries, slowly falling apart and trying to hold himself together by pretending being loyal to Penelope was everything to him, telling himself that he was noble for remaining faithful to her, and it was what he wanted, when it wasn't. He wanted more than this hollow existence, more than drifting through the years alone, lying to himself to stop him from crashing and burning. He wanted to feel again, wanted what others had, yearned for it with a ferocity that shook him and had him wavering on the edge, on the verge of doing something foolish. Like surrendering to Cass, even when he knew it would only end badly for him. He wanted her. She wanted him. It didn't have to be complicated. All he had to do was turn, and she would see his fight was over, that he couldn't go on resisting her. All he had to do was let her take the reins. He turned to do just that, his pulse hammering in his throat, and cursed. She was gone. Chapter 9. Cass stomped around her room in a very unladylike manner, uncaring of whether anyone saw her. Her skin felt too tight, flushed hotly whenever she thought about Daimon and how delectable he had looked in that pool, almost naked. Heat rolled through her veins, stoking her temperature as she ran her fingers over her wrist, recalling how firm his skin had felt against hers, how cool he had been to the touch. She shivered as she let that moment play out again, loving the way his eyes had changed, the flare of passion she had ignited in him warming them as they had tracked her fingers. For a moment, she had felt as if she had been getting somewhere with him, and then he had shut her down with his ridiculous talk of hearts. But she had seen the interest in his eyes, the need that she had stirred when she had touched him and he hadn't heard her. She had felt the hunger in him, the desire. God, she wanted to unleash that side of him. She wanted to know the man he was holding back. She wanted to break down his barriers again and this time not relent until he had surrendered to her. Why couldn't he just give her what she wanted from him? He just had to keep resisting her. It was frustrating to say the least. She was used to getting what she wanted, at least where her coven wasn't concerned. She couldn't recall the last time she'd had to fight this hard for something, but fight she would. Daimon didn't stand a chance against her. The more he resisted her, the stronger her determination to crack the wall of ice surrounding him became. She reminded herself that she didn't want his heart. This thing between her and Daimon was purely physical. She kept telling herself that as she rifled through her things, trying to find something to wear, something that would fit her mood. She paused and stared at the mound of black clothes on top of the dresser before her as a feeling crept up on her, sneaking in while she struggled to convince herself that Daimon was nothing more than a fling to her, a nice way to pass the time. Cass struggled to shake it off. There was no room in her life for the sort of thing part of her clearly foolishly desired. It was impossible, ridiculous, dangerous. She balled her hands into fists in her clothes and stared hard at them, trying to shut down the rebellious feeling. She really didn't want his heart. She couldn't afford to fall for anyone. Yet there was something about the stoic, silent Daimon that drew her to him, had her finding it difficult to keep her distance from him. His eyes shimmered with pain at times, fathomless and dreadful, and she wanted to know the source of it. He wasn't helping her keep her distance either. He was making himself a challenge, and Cass had always risen to a challenge. So far, all she had learned was his heart apparently belonged to another, something Cal had shrugged off and said he knew nothing about when Cass had suddenly dropped it into a conversation, and that the cold aura Daimon projected was about more than the manifestation of his power. Her hand stopped on a dress in the middle of the pile, and she lifted it before her. It was sexy, sheer down the sides, perfect for drawing the eye of an eligible male, especially if she wore it with no underwear. A hot flush tripped through her when she recalled how Daimon had reacted a few weeks ago in the garden here, when she had been chasing after him and had lifted her dress because it had been slowing her down. How his eyes had burned with hunger when he had stared at the exposed curve of her hip and realized she hadn't been wearing any panties. Cass closed her eyes and pictured that moment, let it build in her mind again as she feathered her fingers down her neck. She tweaked the scene a little, had him take a step towards her and close the distance, gasped as she imagined him reaching out and fisting her dress in his hands, tugging her towards him. She lowered her hand to her breast, licked her lips, and tilted her head back as he kissed down her throat, as he pulled her dress up and planted his strong hands against her bare backside. Pulled her against him. A moan threatened to slip from her lips. She held it back, her breath coming faster, as imaginary Daimon behaved far more nicely than his real-life counterpart, surrendering to the attraction that burned between them. Her fingers slipped from her breast, palm skimming over her stomach, that liquid fire Daimon had ignited in her veins in Hong Kong, roaring back into an inferno as she pictured him in those tiny shorts, delectable body spotted with water, light shimmering across hard muscles made for fingers to explore, to tease. Cass rolled her hips forward as her hand reached them, screwed her face up when pleasure arced through her and the fantasy built in her mind. Daimon squeezed her backside, dropped his lips to her breasts to tease them with a skilled, cool tongue, before falling to his knees before her. She arched forwards, her head falling back as his mouth covered her, that wicked tongue sending her out of her mind as it stroked between her thighs. Oh, gods! She sank her teeth into her lower lip and surrendered to the fantasy, her heart pounding and blood rushing as pleasure built inside her. Close. She was close. God, she needed this, had to take the edge off somehow. Release eluded her, though, and frustration began to replace pleasure as she sought it. She clung to the fantasy, desperate now, her breaths coming faster as she stretched for that one flick of her fingers that would send her over the edge. It refused to come. Damn it! A shiver bolted through her when she sensed Daimon return, smelled snow and spice in the cool morning air. Release hit her like a wrecking ball, had her legs wobbling beneath her and her hand flying to cover her mouth as she cried into it. Oh, sweet gods! She fumbled for the dresser with her other hand, clutched it and leaned into it for support as wave after wave of bliss swept through her. Cass sagged forwards, her hand dropping from her mouth, unsure she would ever recover. "You look like shit," Cal said. Cass tensed and turned, her heart shooting into her mouth as panic gripped her and her cheeks burned. The thought she had just been caught pleasuring herself wreaking havoc on her and causing a whirlwind of lame excuses to fill her mind. Only the sliding white door of the room was closed. He wasn't talking to her. She crept to the panels that formed the wall of the room near the covered walkway, eased the one that acted as a door back a little and peered out through the gap. Daimon stood on the wooden walkway of the wing opposite her, bathed in early morning light. She shivered, achy again as she studied him. She cursed him. What was it about him that had her on fire with just a glance at him? Cal approached him from her right, the direction of the main room of the house. Daimon shrugged, rolling toned shoulders beneath his tight long-sleeve turtleneck sweater. She wanted to peel that off him. She shook that rogue thought away. "Tired," he muttered and stifled a yawn. "Still can't sleep?" Concern filled Cal's blue eyes. Daimon was having trouble sleeping. She could help him with that if he let her, and she wasn't even talking about wearing him out with sex, although that was far more appealing than using a spell on him. Daimon shook his head and ran a hand down his mouth. "I need to unwind or something." Cass could help him with that, too. He had certainly helped her unwind just now. She couldn't imagine how he would react if she told him he had starred in a wicked fantasy that had given her one hell of a memorable release. Her cheeks heated again. She huffed, irritated by the reaction. She was a grown woman, and there was absolutely zero reason for her to feel ashamed of what she had done. "Where is everyone?" His icy blue eyes scanned the garden, and she ducked back behind the panel as they neared her, not wanting him to see her. She swore his gaze lingered in her direction, but she could feel him staring straight through the panels of the room at her. She looked down at herself. Just how good was their sense of smell? Her face heated again. Could he smell her, what she had done? The thought he might be aware of it had a hot, achy shiver rolling through her, and her nipples beaded, her breasts yearning for his touch. She huffed and ignored her rebellious body, trying to regain control of herself. She was damned if she was going to let Daimon see how flustered he had gotten her. Aries took Megan back to get some rest. Karis just left. Merrick took Katerina to see her brother. Cal hesitated. She went out with some friends for the day. I think she needed the pick-me-up today. Valen and Ava are keeping an eye on her from a distance. I thought the place seemed quiet. Me and Mari just got done with the bath, Cal said, and Cass peered at them again, tempted to scowl at him. She reminded herself that Mari was a grown woman. It was still hard to accept that at times. Mari would always be the little girl she adored, had watched growing up, and had been sad when she had been forced to keep her distance so she wouldn't notice that Cass didn't age. Although Mari had had a wonderful idea. A bath did sound good. You should have one. Might help you relax and sleep. Cal shrugged, his shoulders hiking beneath his black t-shirt. Just an idea. It's a good one. Long baths are always nice. Daimon smiled at his younger brother. A genuine one. He was right. Long baths were always nice. But long baths with another were even better. She huffed as she looked back at her clothes and hit a snag. She didn't have a bathing suit with her. Cass shrugged that off. Cal would be occupied with Mari for some time, and Aiko was out of the house for the morning at the very least. The only one liable to see her was the only one she wanted to see her. She had some decency, though. She plucked a black lace bra and matching panties from her pile of clothing and slipped them on, following it with an onyx satin robe. She hurried from the room. Not a sprint. Sprinting wasn't very ladylike. But she did make it to the bathing area in record time, beating Daimon there. She stopped on the damp tiles that separated the showers on her left from the stone pool on her right. It was large, almost a small swimming pool, and the view from it was breathtaking. Her gaze traversed the sweeping lines that had been raked into the pale gravel of the Zen garden to swirl around rocks and pockets of greenery, danced over the delicately clipped topiary to the large maple tree that was turning red, and then the crisp blue sky beyond. Steam curled from the surface of the water, tempting her to slip into it to chase away the chill of the autumn morning. She shed her robe, placing it on one of the dry stools at the side of the bathing area, and then twisted her black hair into a knot at the back of her head, securing it with a pin she formed with a spell. She washed off, hurrying through the process, and then stepped into the water. It was hot, reminded her of the spring bath the older witches had been allowed to enjoy at the coven. Only here, she wasn't expected to get all warmed up in the bath and then do something ridiculous like jumping into the snow or icy water. Here, all she had to do was relax. She stepped down from the submerged step that ran along the width of the pool, acting as a seat, and sank into the water. She ended up kneeling near the showers and staring out at the Zen garden as the sun rose higher. It touched the maple first, chasing the shadow down it and brightening the vivid color of its leaves. Had reached the stone lantern at the far end of the Zen garden when she realized she wasn't alone. She looked over her shoulder at Daimon where he stood at the end of the corridor that led to the main room, clutching a white towel in front of him. Banked heat burned in his ice-blue eyes, had another achy shiver tripping through her. "What are you doing?" he growled.
Bathing?
She swished her hands through the water as she turned to face him.
I thought that was obvious.
Heat chased over her skin, sending waves of tingles down her arms and spine as she soaked in the glorious sight of him in his tiny shorts, and decided the sight of Daimon nearly naked should be illegal. All that immaculate bare flesh stretched taut over honed muscles. It was just too much. She ignored the way he growled at her like a rabid animal and took her time, drinking her fill of him, tracing her gaze over the flat slabs of his pectorals and down the valley between them, to the start of his stomach muscles. They flexed as her eyes landed on them, and she bit back a moan. Wicked God! He was doing it on purpose, taunting her with what she wanted to touch. Looking at him wasn't enough. She wanted to explore him with her fingers, wanted to trace the valley between his 8-pack and circle his navel, just as that ink did. She frowned. Ink. How had she missed that last night? The tribal sun was all sharp spikes a few shades darker than his skin, but as she stared at it, she swore it shifted, darkening a shade more towards black, and those straight lines gaining a subtle wave. Maybe it had been too dark at the pool for her to see it, or maybe she had been too swept up in the glorious sight of him to notice the small things. Now she couldn't take her eyes off it. It was definitely changing, softening. Like his mood? She dragged her eyes away from the ink, wanting to see if that was the case. His blue eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, flecked with diamonds, fixed not on her face but on her body.
Is that your favor, Mark?
She waggled a finger towards his stomach. His eyes shot up to lock with hers, and his white eyebrows knitted hard above them as his irises went from blue to white, and the lines of his favor mark went from subtle waves to jagged spikes. It definitely reflected his mood. "Get out. It's my turn to bathe." His fingers tightened in the towel, causing a ripple effect. Muscles tensed in a wave, a symphony that delighted her. Cass swept her arm out above the water.
The bath is big enough for the both of us.
His eyes narrowed in a way that said he didn't believe it was. She murmured softly,
Unless you're scared of bathing with a woman, I could get out.
She slowly stood, the water sluicing down her body, dragging his eyes down from her face. He stared at her, really stared. Passion flared in his eyes again, lighting them with sparks of white and silver. Cass trembled as goosebumps erupted across her skin, savoring the feel of his gaze on her as he took her in. All of her. His lips parted, his gaze distant as he muttered, "Get moving. Out or under the water. I don't care which, just cover up." Cass rolled her shoulders and waded deeper, heading towards the end of the stone pool nearest the Zen garden, giving her back to him to flash the fact her black lace panties didn't cover the curves of her backside. A sharp thrill chased through her as his gaze fell there, scalding her, and she swore he growled under his breath. Water splashed behind her, adding to that thrill, quickening her breath and heating her blood. Part of her had expected him to leave, to run as far as he could from her. Was she making progress with him? Cass reached the far end of the stone bath and shyly turned to face him, sinking under the water at the same time so he barely caught a glimpse of her front. She stretched her arms out along the edge of the pool, tipped her head back, and loosed a long sigh as heat suffused every inch of her, and her breast crested the surface.
This is bliss,
she moaned. Knock it off, Daimon grunted. I'm meant to be relaxing. She lowered her eyes to him, almost chuckled. He had his head tipped back and a small damp towel draped over his eyes. She snuck closer, slipping silently through the water, her pulse accelerating as anticipation rolled through her, and she waited for him to catch her.
How come you don't freeze the water?
A little light conversation would keep him distracted from her closing the distance between them. He muttered, I don't want to talk about it.
Well, I do.
Do you always get what you want? He bit out and dragged the towel from his face as he lowered his head. His white eyebrows knitted hard as he noticed her and the fact she was closer now.
Most of the time.
All the time. Well, at least until Daimon had walked into her life. Perhaps not all the time even then. The coven was another exception. What they wanted, they got, whether she liked it or not. She pushed that out of her mind, refusing to let it sour her mood when she had Daimon in the water with her, deliciously close to naked and not looking as if he was going to bolt. He huffed and tipped his head back again. Progress. He wasn't pushing her away or forcing her back to the other end of the bath. His bare chest heaved on a sigh, muscles stretching and flexing in a way that lured her gaze down to it and mesmerized her. The water is cooler around me, but the constant heat from the thermal spring below the house that supplies it is enough to stop it from turning to ice.
Is it cooler around you?
She moved before he could protest, using a swiftness spell to have her pressed against him in the blink of an eye. He jerked away, scowled at her.
I only wanted to see if you were telling the truth,
she pouted. He stared at her, looking as if he wanted to lash out at her. But then he grabbed her nape and dragged her to him, their bodies colliding and mouths dangerously close as he gazed down into her eyes. He husked, "Does this satisfy your curiosity?" A shiver tripped along her spine as he palmed the back of her head, his hand cool against it, addling her mind. She retained enough sense to give the spell she had used to prevent his ice from hurting her another top-up. Her breath trembled, the strangest feeling running through her as she stared into his eyes, able to pick out all the flecks of blue and white and silver this close to him. Nerves. She couldn't remember the last time she had been nervous about anything, and definitely couldn't remember the last time a man had made her feel this way, as if she was coming and going at the same time, spinning in circles and being turned inside out. Afraid of what might happen, but desperate for it at the same time. His cool breath fanned across her lips, his chest shifting against hers as his breath quickened. Did he feel the same sense of anticipation? She mustered her courage and settled her palm on his left pectoral, stroked her fingers downwards to graze his nipple and the start of his stomach. His breath hitched, his body tensing beneath her questing fingers, and his gaze turned distant and hazy again.
Does this satisfy yours?
She whispered, her mouth drying out as she dared herself to inch her lips towards him. He ruined the chance by turning his profile to her, his gaze falling to her hand as he murmured, "How do you do that?" Cass smiled softly.
It's magic.
He turned his head towards her again, their lips almost touching, and an ache bloomed inside her, a powerful need consuming her. She needed him to kiss her. She wanted to know what it would feel like. He leaned closer, and she swore her heart stopped. Water slammed over her, her senses reeled, and she gasped. It poured into her throat, triggering dark images, memories she wanted to forget. They flashed across her mind in rapid succession as she desperately clawed her way to the surface, as she coughed and struggled to get air into her lungs and purge the water. When she could breathe again and the fear that had gripped her subsided, she narrowed her eyes on Daimon where he lounged at the other end of the pool, looking for all the world as if he had done nothing wrong, as if he had felt nothing as he'd watched her struggling to the surface and fighting for air. Her hoarse breaths raked in her ears as fury poured through her veins to obliterate the softer things she had been feeling.
That's twice you've tried to drown me,
she snapped and stood, and the water around her trembled as her magic rose within her, filling her with a need to give as good as she had gotten and show him what it was like to be drowned. Not a flicker of regret crossed his handsome features as he stood and stepped from the water, as he scowled at her as if she were to blame for everything. She didn't bother holding back this time.
You were the one who tried to kiss me.
He flashed short fangs and stormed away from her, but in the brief moment before he had turned away, she caught the pain in his eyes. Fathomless, dreadful. Cass sank back into the water, all her fight draining from her. He had said his heart belonged to another, but that wasn't the truth. Someone had broken it, and for some reason he was holding on to the tattered remains rather than trying to heal it. She stared in the direction he had gone, whispered,
Who hurt you?